That's okay.
Welcome to the Republican Professor. This morning we have Dr. Jonathan Reibsamen joining us from South Carolina, right?
Correct. Columbia, South Carolina. Cola City, they call it.
They call it what?
Cola City.
Cola City. Oh,
Cola
City. Okay.
Cola City.
I was going to say, why the Spanish? I don't get it. Like Ola City. I'm in frozen California as usual. Curtis is not with us today. He's traveling. But you got your coffee, I can see. Is that coffee?
It's black tea.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And I've got my coffee here. Earl Grey?
Yes. No, this is just black tea. I could go look at it if you want. I could see what the label, but
well, we're not getting any sponsorships yet, so
okay,
maybe later. But
okay.
we need to exact money from these companies if they want. They don't need any free publicity. But are you at your office there at?
I am.
Say where you're at, or?
Yeah, Columbia International University, small school, very small school in Columbia, South Carolina. So I am in my office.
Oh, cool.
I'm standing up though, because I prefer to stand. I have a standing desk now. I'm getting old. I'm still moderately young the last time we spoke to each other, but
you're one of those people that gets older?
I am.
As time goes by? Okay.
Correct.
I've heard of that.
I feel it in my back.
Condition.
I tend to feel it in my back. So that's just in the last couple of years. Really the last year, I started experiencing a lot of low back pain. But I've done a couple of things. One is I stop sitting down when I'm in my office. I stand up.
Okay.
And then doing back exercises, planks and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then just kind of actually fixing some diet stuff seems to have helped as well.
Really? Wow.
So I haven't been having the pain's much better, but I still try to stand up. Cool. If I sit very long at all, I start to feel it.
What dietary stuff have you changed?
Trying to, well, I mean, this part's very recent, so maybe it's even too recent to attribute anything to it. We're all aware of the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. And we don't want to fall into that.
Well, you and I are, but that doesn't mean that everybody listening to this is. You want to say what that is?
Sure. Yeah. So it's a Latin phrase that means after this, therefore because of this. And it's a very common fallacy people fall into of thinking that just because one thing happened and then something else happened, that the first one caused the second one. And so just because I've made changes to my diet and I'm feeling healthier in various ways doesn't necessarily mean they're connected. They might be. It's a good ground for a kind of hypothesis that then you can go test. Sure. But yeah.
And say the name of it again.
Dietary change. Post hoc ergo propter hoc, but it's better known just as the post hoc fallacy.
Yes. Yeah, there's a show called West Wing that was on like 20 years ago, I think. Did you ever watch it? West Wing?
No, I remember when it was the huge hit, but I never got into it.
Yeah, well, I think their first episode was called, or it was in the first season, I know that. It might have been the first episode that was called Post hoc ergo propter hoc. So little reference there for you. Same thing. Then I thought it was cool that they did a show allegedly around a fallacy, a logical fallacy. But they didn't have a philosopher writing it, so I could tell.
That's too bad. Yeah.
They had somebody that taught. Is my sound okay on your end?
I hear you fine. I'm using my little earbud here.
Okay.
I can just use one.
I hear a little noise. Hopefully it's not too bad.
Oh, I hope it's not coming from my end.
No, it seems to be coming from my end, but that's
okay. Well, I don't hear it. You sound fine to me.
Okay, good. Well, anyway, I wanted to share a little anecdote of Jonathan. Jonathan and I were well, which one do I want to use? I think we sat at the same table at the 20-year not reunion, but 20-year anniversary of the Biola MA philosophy program.
Was it 20 or 25? For some reason I thought it was 25. But
might have been 25. That sounds actually better. Yeah. 2012, I believe it was May or April, something like that. And I think Rob Coons was at our table, and Daniel Bonavec, and Gary Osmondson, I think, was there, sitting there.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
So, well,
Alex Plato, was he sitting at the same table?
Probably.
Yeah.
Sounds like something he would do. Yeah. So Jonathan, I've known since our days at Biola. We had among other things, an evidentialism seminar toward the end of my time there. And that was great fun. Jonathan went on to, did you go straight into a PhD program after that?
After Talbot, I took a year off.
Oh, okay. What did you do for a year?
I went to Scott. It's now called Scott Christian University. At the time, it was Scott Theological College in Kenya.
Oh, wow.
I taught there for one term. I had the opportunity, and I decided, it's a chance to try out this professor thing and see if I really want to start the whole PhD route. And it was a confirming experience. So that was helpful. I also worked I worked in Orange County at a home for troubled boys. It was one of these group homes for boys who had kind of flunked out of the foster system. Wow. So I worked there for almost a year, maybe about 10 months. And then I left there to go do the teaching in Africa.
How long were you in Africa?
For just one term. So they were on the quarter system. So I was there for about 3 months.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so not very long, but it was my first full-time classroom teaching experience, since it was just 2 classes, but since it's a quarter system, that's full-time.
Yeah. So are they on the Oxford system, like the Hillary Michaelmas term, or is that what they call it down there? Or?
They didn't use that term. They just said quarter system.
Okay.
That's all they called it. Yeah. And they were having the debate over whether they should stick with that or go to semesters. I don't know how that turned out, but that was going on. Yeah, you really felt the British culture down there from the colonial era. Yeah. Like everybody, sure. They great coffee there. They had coffee plantations, but everybody drank tea. Nobody drank coffee.
Oh, that's sad.
So, yeah.
That's funny, actually. Is that where you got into tea? Was it in Africa?
Well, I'm still more into coffee. It's just for my afternoon, if I have caffeine in the afternoon, which I usually don't, I take it in the form of tea because it's a little less intense. So, and there's what, antioxidants or something? I mean, black tea is supposed to be.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I've heard that. I've heard it's great for you. I've heard that about coffee as well, though. So
yeah.
Now you went to I believe you went to St. Louis University for your PhD in philosophy. And I think you went the same time as like a bunch of other people, like Tedla and Alex and
then there were some
Aaron, maybe.
Friends. Yes, Aaron
Clark.
Charity Anderson, do you remember her?
Oh yeah. Charity,
yeah, so she went there. She arrived, I think, the year before.
Oh yes, I remember her.
She actually finished it. Yeah, she finished in just 5 years. So
she's always so delightful to talk to.
Yeah,
got a bright, beaming smile and very kind person.
Yes.
Very bright. Yeah.
Yeah.
So now, what drew you to St. Louis? Was it epistemology that you wanted to do?
Yes, it was, and they were also pretty strong in philosophy of religion. So they were
okay. Stump. Who was there in philosophy of religion?
Eleanor Stump's one of the big names, and John Greco. Even though he did epistemology, he was the one that I went to work with in epistemology. But he would write on religious epistemology as well. Let me see. There's Jonathan Jacobs, who he was kind of a younger, getting started professor then, but he's going on to write stuff in philosophy of religion and. Let's see, Susan Brower Toland, also philosophy of religion and medieval philosophy. Some of these people are more like Eleanor Stump and Susan Brower Toland are more medieval specialists, but they cross over into philosophy of religion. Obviously, there's an easy tie there to make with medieval philosophy.
Yeah.
So so you had a few people like that.
And I know we had Alex on, and he went to work with John Greco as well, but then he changed when he was there. Did you change or did you stay?
No, I stayed. I stuck with him. He and I got along very well. I appreciated his style of, directing a dissertation.
Okay.
And I watched the interview with Alex. What was it? Almost 4 hours. It was at least 3 hours.
It was 3 hours. Yeah.
3 hours. Yeah.
I know, because I always listen to them again, so I describe it well.
Yeah.
And just so I never have to do it again, like I go,
Uh-huh.
okay, I now I know there was no issues with that. There's no problems with that.
Yeah.
It's great. It's great. You know.
Yeah. So once you get a huge staff, you'll have to cut those into episodes. Like, here's when we talked about this topic, and here's when we talked about that topic.
People keep telling me to do that, but I don't have the energy for that, and I don't have
Right.
I don't know the technology very well, so I'm a technological idiot.
Well, I'm there with you.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know how to do that. So let's see. Were we just
So
talking?
you did epistemology. So you stayed with Greco, right?
Yes, I stayed with Greco. So I know that, so Alex said that he kind of didn't really appreciate as much the way it was done once he got into it.
Yeah.
And other questions weren't interested, but I still stayed interested in it, and I did appreciate the way it was done. So I stuck with it and finished out my dissertation in the same vein.
You mentioned you appreciated the way that John Greco does his dissertation advising. What can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, at least for my personality, he struck a really good balance between providing direction and giving freedom. That's the main thing that I mean.
That's cool.
So there are some dissertation directors that are very sort of strong-handed in how they might direct a dissertation.
Yeah.
And there are others who are just, all right, you're almost on your own. And I think he, at least for my personality, he did a really good job of providing me direction when I needed it, but also saying like, hey, if you don't want to take it the direction I think you should, then explore your direction. So I really appreciated that about him.
So I'm looking behind you at your volumes, and I see some familiar ones. Yeah. I see Alan Bloom's Plato. I see. Is that the Republic? Probably.
Yes.
The white volume.
Right. This is the Hackett edition. I bought a lot of the Hackett stuff because they're cheap, but they're pretty good too. And
then I see Copleston's History of Philosophy up there on the top.
Yeah.
That's, I think, the only stuff I can make out. I think maybe
that you would have recognized the old edition of it. That is the Philosophical Foundations book from Moreland and Craig, but that's the updated edition of it.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't recognize that one.
Cool. And this is Eleanor Stump and Brian Davies, the Oxford Handbook of Aquinas.
Oh, I don't have that.
So she was one of my professors, and she was on my dissertation committee.
Oh, cool.
So she's really an Aquinas specialist. That's her big thing. But she brings Aquinas into contemporary conversations.
That's awesome.
So that's what that is.
Is that?
See, now I've got to unplug.
What's that one that the orange one? Is that?
I guess I didn't have to put it back.
That looked like a. Okay, so we don't have to go through your entire library, but
right. I've got more stuff over that way. So.
Oh yes, there you go.
Yeah.
Now, okay, so you did your PhD dissertation on epistemology, and for people who just started listening to this, maybe they didn't hear the other episodes where we define epistemology every single time we use the term. So we'll just continue that tradition. That way people can start anywhere and they don't have to feel like they need to listen to 7 hours before they get the definition of epistemology. But
right. Yeah. So
how would you define it?
Simple way is just the theory of knowledge, or an attempt to explain knowledge and related concepts, such as justification, rationality, even terms that are sometimes considered part of the definition, even though that's always disputed, but like belief, what does it mean to believe something? So any kind of term that tends to come up when you start talking about knowledge, that term also becomes part of what you explore and examine when you do epistemology. But the key idea is theory of knowledge.
Knowledge is important. We like knowledge.
Yes, some people do. Yes.
How do we get knowledge? What's it mean to know something? Do you have a rough and ready definition of that you've come to?
Yeah. So, well, I mean, there's different definitions I could give, and of course, you and I were in an evidentialism seminar, and so we would have heard it defined a certain way. My professor, John Greco, he's not an evidentialist. He's what he would use the term virtue reliableness. And that's kind of the framework with which I did in my dissertation, I adopted that framework in order to explore certain questions, even though I think that you didn't have to do that in order to, it was just like, let's adopt a framework in order to explain these concepts. But there would be other ways of explaining it. Anyway, you're gonna have to keep like pulling me back on track because I tend to go way off.
That's fine. That's what I'm here for.
But yeah, so you said define knowledge. So one really simple definition that I think almost everybody can agree with, but then they'll almost always say, well, but it's not enough. We need to know more. Is from Linda Zagzebski, who is just so your listeners know, she's a Catholic philosopher who's been very influential in both I would say moral theory, maybe a little more recently, but epistemology was one of her big areas, especially virtue epistemology. And so she says that knowledge most simply is just cognitive contact with reality. So it's when the way you think about things matches the way things are.
Cognitive contact with reality.
In, right, but then all the work comes in when you say, okay, but what do we mean by contact?
Yeah,
and cognitive, and maybe reality.
And you can see this now. Maybe we should describe a little bit of what people might be experiencing here. Is it seems like you take one word and then you say, okay, epistemology is a study of knowledge. Okay, well, what's knowledge? Oh, according to Zagzebski, it's this lady who taught at Loyola Marymount for a long time, by the way, where I taught for a long time. Although we didn't overlap, but she was like a legend there. Zagzebski says that knowledge is cognitive contact with reality. And you're saying that's pretty good, right? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that's good enough, probably good enough to get started. And then but then when you get to more precise definitions, it's going to be trying to hash out, okay, well, what does that mean to have cognitive contact with reality?
Yeah.
And then the normative conditions, like are there norms about how you are to go about getting into cognitive contact with reality, so that you have to do it this way in order to really count as knowledge and so forth.
One thing that might be a little bit odd for people that are not Phil nerds like us, or like I should say like you. I guess I do count as that. I mean, if I can follow, if I can follow what you're saying, I'm probably a Phil nerd too. But I did teach it for 15 years, so I guess that counts. But Phil, the philosophical method is the analytic method. It's the analytic tradition. So it's a thing in the history of philosophy that's been quite pronounced most recently, I would say, although it's probably there in some way throughout the history of philosophy. But most recently, there's a thing called the analytic tradition, Anglo-analytic tradition. And I think, wouldn't you say that you're in that tradition? You're squarely in that tradition?
Pretty squarely in that tradition, yes. I try not to be snobbish about those who are not.
Okay. That's good.
And I do appreciate that there are weaknesses and shortcomings in that tradition.
What would you say the strengths are of that analytic?
The strengths are like the emphasis on being really clear and precise in what the words that you use.
I like that too. Some people get really frustrated though if you keep defining terms. They can't keep up with it, and then they get tired. Their mind gets tired.
Right. Yes.
And that's why they don't like it, is because their mind gets tired.
Right. But then the irony is also that as you define terms, sometimes you realize that just a common word isn't really going to cut it anymore, because you've got to be more precise than common language is. Yeah. And then you start introducing all your terms of art. And the next thing you know, it's just as confusing to someone who hasn't been following along. It's just as confusing as the continental philosopher who's, doing really the same thing. Maybe they just start doing it sooner. I don't know. But
would you say that's the downside of it?
Yeah, that's one of the downsides, is because you're trying to be so precise that you do end up having to introduce a lot of technical distinctions that can be hard to track with. So that's one of the downsides. And then another downside, at least historically, I don't know if this is true today still, but historically is that this part probably is that there's a tendency to get ever more narrowly focused on like I'm trying to understand this one thing. And then I realize that one thing, I've got to get really precise to this thing. And then next thing you know, you're spending like years talking about this one tiny idea.
Years.
It's a good reason that got you there. It was like some really important question that got you there. But now this is where your career is this one little tiny thing. And it's no longer this like breadth of like philosophical and everything. It's now like, I'm trying to understand exactly this one little tiny thing. And so
Yeah,
that's a potential downfall.
that's
as
good.
well.
That's good stuff. I think one of the benefits of doing this podcast, I think, is trying to um, give folks in our what we do a chance to talk about what it is we're doing, what it is you're doing, in a way that maybe people can appreciate. Like, for example, it might be kind of puzzling for some people to think, what in the world does a philosopher do? How do you just make a living as a philosopher? And is that a worthwhile activity? And the thing you just described, like getting ever more precise, and then it's just so confusing, even professionals have a hard time with it. See, you can see from a certain angle, it feels maybe like a waste of time or something. Someone might think that, but it's really not a waste of time ultimately, because these are questions that really impact our lives, like knowledge. What is knowledge? Turns out that people disagree about parts of that, and that's maybe the part they're missing, is that it's not that everybody agrees necessarily with the outcome. And so it's kind of, and sometimes the disagreement can well, I want to give you a chance to talk about what your thoughts are, you react about what I just said.
Yeah, so I mean, there is a lot of disagreement in the world of professional philosophy, of course there is. And part of that has to do with what we call the sociology of the discipline, which is that in order to try to, at least if you're trying to really turn it into if you're trying to rise in the field, I guess you would say, like you're trying to make a real reputation for yourself. And there's a variety of reasons someone might really make it their desire to make a reputation. The first would be pragmatic, because it increases my chances of landing a job or landing a better job or something like that. And then of course there's just the usual, I'll use the word temptations of pride and status and all of that.
And that exists in philosophy. I mean, a lot of people
it does. It exists in
this.
Academia in general, and it does exist in philosophy too.
What does that look like?
So it can look like, so this is how it relates to the disagreement, is there's a motive to disagree, because it is by showing somebody else to be wrong. Well, that's one path you could take.
Yeah, that's a really important thing you just said.
Identify, and it's often put as you'll try to figure out like what the going opinion is, or what the received tradition is, and then show how you can show that that's wrong.
Okay. Yeah, that's huge.
And
so that's the way you get advancement and notoriety. And is it more money? Do you get more money?
Well, I don't know about that. More conference presentation opportunities, maybe.
But those are given for free,
but
right?
you could get what
motivates the philosopher is what we're trying to get at. It's not money.
Right. So it's not entirely money. In fact, I would say that it's not. In fact, I would say it's not. It's definitely not entirely money. There might be some money in there if you want to get, like, I want the better paying job, but it's still a job in philosophy.
Yeah.
So there's a limit to how much
upper limit. What do you think the upper limit is?
More. Oh shoot, I don't know.
Is it?
No clue.
What do you think the highest paid philosopher gets? You think?
You mean? I assume that you mean not including book royalties.
Yeah. Right.
It's worthless. It's utterly worthless because it's a guess. I would bet not over 300,000.
Well, that's higher than I thought. I was going to say 150.
What I'm thinking is if it's somebody who is really eminent at a very wealthy private institution.
Yeah. Okay.
Like maybe they could get up toward that level. I mean, maybe I should have said 200,000. I don't know. But it'll be like,
hard to know.
Yeah.
Well, now, okay, so
nothing like corporate CEO level, or
no,
or even a
lot of CEOs make
business
that.
School or something.
Yeah, you could be a CEO and run your own business and be making a lot less than that.
Absolutely right.
So, a lot of people are not even making
major. No, I thought all CEOs were filthy rich and evil.
Yeah. And we'll have links to Amazon, on this description here. Well, okay, so you studied epistemology. You were very concerned about getting knowledge right. What aspect of epistemology did you find to be the most interesting? Are you still an evidentialist, or were you? I guess I should ask you, or were you ever?
I will. Well, when it comes to a lot of that, like, here's one of my weaknesses. I don't know. Well, I don't know if it's a weakness. I would just say one of the my characteristics is I'm kind of skeptical, which is probably why I got into epistemology in the first place. But it also means that.
What do you mean by skeptical?
So by skeptical, I mean a little bit on the doubtful side toward a lot of ideas and theories and so forth.
Okay.
I tend to immediately look for, okay, what might not be right about it.
That's your first foot forward, typically?
Often it is. Yes. If someone puts forward a theory, puts forward an explanation, I'll start thinking about counterexamples or something like that. That's what I do pretty typically, which in marriage can not always be a good thing. So you have to learn to temper that in personal relationships.
Oh yeah.
But it does mean that but also I tend to be fairly easily impressed with what a theory gets right. So I'm the kind of person who'll be there saying like, well, I'll think about, well, here's the strengths. It does this and this and this well, but I'm not so sure about this and this. And then I'll be kind of like that toward a lot of different theories. So that's why I say in my dissertation, I said this, blatantly, is I'm adopting a sort of this virtue reliableness framework.
Yeah, you mentioned that. That's really a technical term, virtue reliableness. Right. So
yeah. So it's a certain view it's a non-evidentialist view in epistemology. So the evidentialist view would say something, and this is way too rough, but a general idea would be, if we go back to what knowledge is that you know something if I'll just put it in terms of something that needs to be true, even if other stuff might need to be true as well. So what we call necessary conditions rather than sufficient. So an evidentialist might say, well, knowledge requires having good evidence for whatever it is that you know. Like if you're going to claim to know it, then you need to have evidence.
That's what an evidentialist would say.
Correct. And then
so the question was, are you that? Are you one of those?
Yeah. Guys? And so that's where I'd say it depends on what you mean by evidence. So the reliableness says it's not so much about needing to have evidence, it's that the belief is true because it was formed in a reliable way. Now that's just reliableism. And then the virtue reliableists say, and the right way means through your own intellectual abilities and virtues, that you form the belief in what you might say was an intellectually virtuous kind of way, as opposed to an intellectually vicious kind of way. And virtue is often treated, at least in the virtue reliableist camp, virtues and abilities, those terms are used almost interchangeably. So an intellectual ability, like I have the ability to see like my computer screen right now. And so I believe I'm having a conversation with Lucas Mather over the internet.
Good.
And what else I believe is that you're in California. So I believe I'm having a conversation with you because of what I see on the screen. But I believe that you're in California because you told me you were.
And you trust me.
And I trust you. I believed you because I trust you when you say that. I trust that that's true. It's not because I see the Golden Gate in the background.
You're right.
Because I know that's a lie. That's a dirty lie.
All movies are lies. Every time we watch, Netflix or Amazon, we go to AMC. I'm like, I'm paying you to lie to
lies.
Me, and I'm just pretending that it's a pretend time, and I give money to act like I believe what's going on here. So they don't really know each other. They're not really married. That's not really their kids. They don't really live there. That's not really their dog. He didn't really die on the beach in Normandy in Saving Private Ryan. I walked out. I was like,
this is a lot. Well, I know you know this, but there have been people who really believe that and thought that way. That
when I'm teaching, when I'm teaching,
never making up. Yeah.
When I'm teaching and I use films, I'll pick one of those two things to do. I'll either say I'll do the lie one, or I'll say I cannot believe they killed all those people just to make Saving Private Ryan. But it's worth it if you think about it, because we need to know about World War II.
We need that story, and
it's worth it to kill all those people. I can't believe they signed up for it, to be honest with you. Well, okay, so go back to virtue reliabilitist. We get off track, but we always come back. So
yes, yeah.
Now, I would say, since according to the emails I'm getting from pod status, that they say this is ranking well in government, specifically in government. So people are the kind of people that are listening to this apparently are people that don't have a philosophical background necessarily, but they're interested in how the connection, even a little bit of a connection is. So I know we tend to, I think the tendency for some of the specialists I've had on is they might be thinking of their colleagues if the colleague heard them I almost said misgender, but define something or something. That might happen. It might be a little bit sloppy, but that's okay because we're really
so I'll try to think about your listener.
Yeah, we're trying to,
and I'm not going to worry about being too precise.
Don't be too, try to, if you're going to err a little bit, that's okay. Fine. You could go back and fix it later. It's fine. But
I hereby disavow everything I will say from this point forward.
Yeah, just capturing, that's good. That's good. Capturing the curiosity. So I guess I think it's a curious general audience, somebody that maybe did an undergraduate in a different discipline, but was always curious about philosophy, or somebody that maybe didn't finish college, but is extremely bright and has a long attention span, and maybe will go back and listen to stuff. So evidentialism is the claim that evidence is a essential part of knowledge, or a necessary condition of knowledge. And that seems pretty common sense to say, yeah, you need evidence for what you believe for you to know it. There's some people that disagree with looking at it that way. There's some technical things in here, like internalism versus externalism. I don't know if you wanted to mention what that is. Seemed like you were assuming. Yeah, so you want to take that really quick?
I guess we could just throw that in very quickly, but we don't want to get into the weeds too much there. But the evidentialist is typically an internalist, meaning the conditions that make the difference between. This is probably worth saying. So you might say that most agree that there is a difference between knowing something and simply believing something that happens to be true. Right. So the example I like to give is if I were to flip a coin and not show you what it was, and I say, well, heads or tails, you might just guess, but there might be some people who are convinced that they are excellent guessers at this. And they're like, I always right.
That's good.
They're just like way overconfident.
That's a good.
And so they'll be like, oh, heads. I know it's heads. Now it might be heads. But suppose I'm looking at it and I can see what it is. And you've got this person who's like, yeah, I know it's heads. And it might be heads, but I wouldn't think that they know it's heads if I haven't shown it to them yet. I might say, you're just overconfident. Like you're guessing, and maybe you guessed right, but so it's true and you believe it's true, but do you know it? And that's where the issue comes in, where we say, well, the epistemic condition, like there's something, and this is where we'll talk about the specifically epistemic condition. So truth is not the epistemic condition. You need it in order to have knowledge. You need your belief to be true. If it's not true, you don't, like if your belief isn't true, then it can't be knowledge. And if you don't believe it, it's not knowledge. Like if you're just like, I have no clue, but this.
So two necessary conditions of knowing.
Right. So
it's got to be true, the proposition.
You have to believe it.
And you have to believe the proposition.
Right. And so then almost everybody agrees that there's something else you need besides that for knowledge.
Okay.
And so then the debate is over exactly what is that.
What is that thing? That's where the debate is. Okay.
Right. The evidentialist says it's got to be that you actually have evidence for that belief.
Yes.
Like maybe.
So that's one position
and then the internalist, who often, evidentialism and internalism often go together.
Yeah.
It would say you have to have internal access to the evidence, right? So it can't be that, well, there's evidence out there. But if I don't have internal awareness, and internal doesn't mean like you look inside my stomach and you find it. It's internal in the sense of my mind, right?
Yeah. You're aware of it in your mind.
I'm internally, I'm aware of the evidence, and I see the evidence, the evidential relationship.
Right.
Whereas the externalist might say, well, sometimes if you can if you have this intellectual ability to know something, or you have this intellectual ability to grasp the truth, you might not be fully aware, fully cognizant of how it is or why it is, but that doesn't mean you don't know it.
Say that one more time. Say, because
so
that's
that-
really,
yeah, let me see
really
if I
good.
can
The way you
figure-
just said it was great.
Yeah, so it could be that there are conditions that have to be met for
Mhm.
my belief that such and such is true, that have to be met, but I might not be aware of those conditions having been met.
Can you give an
But that
example of
doesn't
that?
mean I can't know it.
Yeah.
So so let me try to think of a good
Give an
example
example of
this.
we know something, but we're not aware internally of how that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I
It's the
can't give
condition
any
of knowledge.
uncontroversial examples. I was trying to think of a simple uncontroversial example, and I was like, well, wait, of course there aren't any.
Fair enough. That's
But
fair
an
enough.
example of one that a reliabilist might give. In fact, this will be relevant to my dissertation project. So let me go back to me believing that you're in California because you told me so.
Excellent.
Now that's so the idea might be, okay, you telling me, we could say that's evidence. Of course, but then you have to say, well, what does it mean for something to be evidence? It has to be that's actually a good reason to believe, right? And so if you're at least a certain kind of internalist evidentialist, then you have to say that I'm aware of what it is that makes you saying that a good reason to believe it.
Okay. All right. I got you.
Whereas for a certain kind of reliabilist, they might say, well, look, as long as Lucas is trustworthy in what he has said, we're already assuming true and I believe it. We add to that I trust you and that you are trustworthy. Well, I might not have direct access to your trustworthiness.
Right.
Like I can't just see your trustworthiness.
You see my facial expressions, and maybe you make, or
Right,
you know,
and then-
I see there's some kind of maybe like prehistorical DNA.
Yeah, but
crap
maybe I don't
going
even
on.
have to be thinking about
Yeah.
all that. Like I don't, so
Yeah.
maybe, and again, it's a controversial example, but maybe I can know
Sure.
just because I trust you and you're trustworthy. But notice the and you're trustworthy is something going on outside of my mind. I might not even really be aware of it.
Right. Right.
So that would be the rough idea. So hopefully
So
that's at least
what-
good enough.
what
to give
is
a rough
it?
idea.
Do you believe I'm in California?
I do believe you're in California.
Okay. And what's your
And if you
evidence
start
for that?
So I do have evidence, but almost all my evidence is similar. It all has to do with things that you said and done and presented online. So it's all stuff that you are in control of and you
Gotcha.
could have manipulated.
Yes. Okay. And then does it have anything to do with the type of statement too? Because it's kind of a low, you're not really relying on it. If I wouldn't have any reason to lie about it, I don't gain anything. Is that relevant?
Well, so far as I know, I mean, but we could always tell ourselves stories, right? In which like maybe there's this possibility that I can't rule out that Lucas has something to gain from pretending he's in California when he's not.
Okay.
Like you could make up a story like that. Of course, just using the possibility doesn't make it likely. And so I have no reason to believe that story.
Right.
But if I was like a Cartesian, so Rene Descartes, who said that his method he said it's only knowledge if you have absolute certainty. And for him, the way you figure out if you have absolute certainty is you do everything you possibly can to doubt. And if you succeed in doubting, even a remote possibility, if you succeed, then you don't really know it. And so you've got to rule out all possible error.
That sounds exhausting.
It does, yeah.
And then how do you do that for every single belief that you have? I mean, it's just
right. Well, you'd
have to take classes of beliefs from classes of evidence, which is what he did.
Right. Yeah. So the idea is that that from the reliabilist perspective, maybe we just don't have to do all that exhausting work. Now it's not a rejection of evidence, and I should have to emphasize that. And it is consistent with a reliabilist position to say, yeah, in many cases, perhaps most cases, you really do need good evidence.
Right.
But they would also say that at the end of the day, you've got to have, this is the way a reliabilist might put it, you've got to have knowledge that is not based on evidence in the sense of derived from some kind of an argument where the evidence is like a premise, where you have you're making an inference from evidence as a premise to the conclusion, and that's your knowledge. And the reason you can't do that is because you would be off on an infinite regress pretty quickly. Because then you ask, well, the evidence itself, do you believe that? If so, then it has to be the conclusion. Right. Now any decent evidentialist is going to have quick responses to that. So they'll say, well, there's like basic evidence that is not itself something that has to be justified via belief, Anyway, so this is where there's a threat to get way off into the woods. And there's other more interesting stuff that I'd like to talk about that I think would be more relevant to your listeners. So you mentioned, if you don't mind me.
No, go for it. I'm happy.
And if you think there's anything that I need to clarify, you can pull me back toward the direction we were just talking about.
Fair enough. Yeah.
One reason, so I'd like to say a little bit about why I got interested specifically in the epistemology of trust and what is now being called social epistemology.
Yeah, that's great.
So
trust.
One thing to say
about
it.
Trust is your issue.
Trust is my issue. Yeah, I'm really interested in the phenomenon of trust generally, and then specifically epistemic trust, where it is trusting someone specifically with respect to what you believe, so that you're forming beliefs based on trust in someone else's word, is one way to put it. But obviously trust gets manifested in lots of different ways. But trust has been called the glue of society, that trust is what holds society together, our ability to trust one another in various ways. Yeah. So there's a lot of political theorists, economists, as well as sociologists, psychologists, et cetera, that are really interested in understanding the phenomenon of trust generally. And then I really want to understand it at that epistemic level. And so
when you say epistemic level, you mean as it pertains
having to do with knowledge and
knowledge,
forming beliefs, relying on people relying on others as we form beliefs and that kind of thing.
So obviously anything related to knowledge, which would be business, trust is a huge part of business, and that would have a lot to do with not only business ethics and stuff like that, but just entrepreneurship and all sorts of like advertising, anything related to public policy of a business, and then also politics. Trust is a huge issue in politics as well. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't want to steal your thunder, but trust is a big deal.
Trust is a very big deal. Yeah. And it also has a connection. So I'm a Christian, and I.
Oh yeah, that's good connection too. I don't know why I left that out. Like it's kind of important for that too.
Right. And so when I look back over the history of how I got interested in the academic subjects I got interested in, it always derives back to some non-academic concern that I had. And so one connection that I see going way, way back was when I was a young single man at a church in Austin, Texas, where I was living back in the early 2000s. I remember having a conversation with a young woman there who was kind of going through a crisis of faith, and was questioning her Christian commitment that she was raised in and all of this. And I remember it was actually, I think, an email exchange that we had, but she raised this question: why is faith such a big deal? Why in the Christian religion, we have this idea that you have to have faith. And in the book of Hebrews, it says, without faith it is impossible to please God. And she said, look, isn't believing things on faith, this is using different terminology than she did, but the idea was, isn't that kind of intellectually vicious? Shouldn't we want really good evidence for everything that we believe? Just
intellectually vicious means intellectually vicious
means it means a bad intellectual habit. So vice is
is where is the root of vicious. So it doesn't mean like a vicious dog, like mean or
a
angry.
Vicious dog has vices.
Right, but
as a dog, yeah.
We usually typically just mean it's mean or it'll bite you. Or something.
Yeah. So
the etymology.
Lazy. I don't, the connection of
I don't look at a sleeping lazy dog and go, what a vicious dog.
But you could.
See the deep dark, the roots. The philosophy has so many benefits. You could say that about the lazy dog.
Right. Yeah. So the idea of a vice, it's a contrary term. Yeah, vicious comes from the idea of someone who has vices is a vicious person, and vices come in all kinds of varieties. It's just you can just think of
philosophers are the only ones the philosophers are probably the only ones I hear using the term vicious in the proper way. or I guess in the fullest way. I should say that.
Right.
It's not that it's improper. Yeah.
Rooted in its etymological history.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Yeah. Yeah, basically it's just like, well, why isn't that a bad way to go about living your life? Is
The
like
lady in Austin, she was making a comment about faith, and isn't that right there in the Bible?
Right.
Doesn't that really teach intellectual viciousness or bad habits about
like it teaches
intellect?
people to be gullible. It teaches people to just, not think for themselves.
Did you have an answer for her at that moment, or would that start you on a path?
I had an answer, like I did answer the question, but I don't know if I was totally satisfied with my answer. And I don't remember exactly what the answer was, but it did set me on a path of trying to think about, well, what is faith and why might it be a good thing? And so when I got to St. Louis University, one thing that John Greco was starting to work on was a topic called the epistemology of testimony. So it's the study of the idea that you can acquire knowledge through testimony. How does that work? And so he was just starting to work on that. And I immediately saw the connection between that and the topic of believing things on faith, believing things on trust. And I did end up coming to see faith as very closely related to trust, if not being actually the same thing. That to have faith in someone is to trust that person in various ways.
And that's your view. That's not Greco's view. That's your view.
Well, I mean, that is my view. I don't know if Greco's ever, I think he talks about trust and he talks about trusting testimony. But I don't think he's gotten as far as talking about the relationship between faith and trust. I just don't know. There have been Christian philosophers who've worked on that in recent years. There was a collection of essays edited by one of your former guests, Trent Doherty, right? Mm-hmm. So he was one of the editors, I think. I'm trying to remember. There's some volume I have on my shelf over here, so I keep looking that way, called Faith and Intellectual Virtue. It was a collection of essays. So it is being addressed, but that was,
yeah. So you think that, okay. So if faith is trust, that's not vicious. That's not bad necessarily.
No, but you might say, well, there can be bad forms. Like, have you ever trusted someone that you realize later you shouldn't have?
Well, probably. I have a hard time thinking of an example right now.
But yeah.
Well, I'm trying to answer truthfully. I do believe that that's happened. I just don't remember a specific, because the way you phrased it was someone I shouldn't have trusted, which implies that I violated some epistemic norm, or I was a bit vicious somehow. My intellectual traits weren't as honed as they should have been, ideally, I guess. But so, okay, I'll give you an example. I was friends, not like really close friends, but I was friends with a pathological liar at one point. And this person was a leader in the church, and some crazy stories came out that were hard to believe at first, and then it became apparent that it was true. And anyway, I had a conversation with them. I think the last conversation I had with him was, I said, you're a pathological liar, right? And he said, yeah. Then I was like, well, wait, how do I know you're telling the truth about that then? But it was the kind of thing where he could lie about anything for no reason. It was just the weirdest thing in the world. Turned out he was very good at lying about things that had to do with morality and stuff. But as I, like for example, he might lie about what he ordered at Starbucks. Like, oh, what'd you get? And then you can see it written on the cup, and he makes something else up. It's just weird. It was just, I don't understand it, but in any case, something was broken in him. But I don't know that I should not have trusted him. It's
Right.
just that I did, because
Mhm.
I didn't have any reason not to, and it seemed like I had reason to trust him about things. And anyway, he violated a lot of people's trust. So
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so the idea, the reason I brought up the question was because I don't want to say that every instance of faith or trust is good, is virtuous.
okay.
But I also don't want to say that every instance is bad or vicious. Rather, it's that there's such a thing as a virtuous kind of trust or virtuous faith, and there's such a thing as a vicious or a bad faith. And of course, you can mistrust without it being the result of some vice that you have. But that still wouldn't be an instance of good trust. So it ends up becoming a question of, well, why do we trust the people that we trust when we trust them? What kind of habits of trust do we have? And then what kinds of, now this might be getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but what has to be true about the situation, or you might say the society that we are in, that makes it good to trust in certain ways and not good to trust in other ways?
Yeah.
So I really got into this idea of social norms as a part of my research. And social norms are the norms. Norms, you could think of them as like rules, although they're often implicit, they're often not explicitly stated, about
Right.
how we ought to behave and relate to one another.
Yes.
So there are, as I teach my ethics students here, we could say there's at least 3 different categories of norms. There's legal norms, which are explicit rules. We could call them policies that govern a community. There are social norms, which are often implicit. We learn them by observing behavior, by being raised in a certain way, about how we ought to behave. And then there's moral norms.
Right.
Now, the existence of moral norms as a separate category from both legal and social norms is controversial in our society, but I believe it. And these are the higher norms. So the other norms are to be judged by moral norms. And as I said, I'm a Christian, so I believe that moral norms are God's norms, God's expectations of us. But I understand not everyone believes that. Not everybody who believes in real moral norms believes in that. But the idea, there's at least this category that even if you don't believe they're real, you can understand the category of these kind of norms that stand above and govern. So both social norms and legal norms. And there can be overlap between these. Like if we had a Venn diagram, it would be like the overlapping circles, and we'd have a whole conversation about,
Right.
As I ask students, give me an example of one that's just here, but not there, or in the overlap between these two.
That's good. That's good.
It's a fun conversation to have.
Yeah.
So
rolling up your jeans in 7th grade, that was a social norm. Apparently I was really bad at that. So I was on the social outcast list because I didn't roll my jeans up the right way in 7th grade, but that's not illegal and it's not immoral. It would be very surprising to get to heaven and God, you have the list of sins and you're like, oh, thank the Lord. Thank you, Lord, for dying for me. But it turns out the one sin that wasn't satisfied on the cross was not rolling up your jeans in 7th grade. That would be very surprising to me if I got to heaven and it turned out everybody
list, you're like, oh, thank you for forgiving. Wait, what?
All the angels had their arms crossed and they all had their like
jeans rolled up.
They had jeans on. The angels had jeans on and they were rolled up. And I mean, if I get to heaven and Jesus has jeans on and they're rolled up, the first thing I'm going to say is, oh shit. Because I didn't that. So anyway, we'll edit that cuss word out. But
yeah, that's against the rules.
I'm just being honest, that's a social norm, the cuss word.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we talked about, that's a conversation we have as well as norms about language and all that kind of stuff.
Yes, that's good.
So I was going to say about that example. So in 7th grade, I did roll up my jeans legs, but I think I don't know if I'm a little bit younger than you or what, I don't know, but the norm had changed.
I'm 27. I turn 27 every year. So does that help?
Well, happy birthday.
Do you trust me?
So I was made fun of for having my jeans rolled up when I shouldn't have.
Interesting.
because the norm had changed. So people would say things to me, I didn't know what they were talking about. They'd be like, "Hey, are you expecting a flood?" I was like, "What?" I was really confused. What? I remember a distinct moment, like some kid seeing me coming out of the bathroom, be like, "Hey, you expecting a flood?" Like, huh? And the other kids laughing.
Were you the only one that didn't have them rolled up, or did have them rolled up?
Yeah, I don't really remember.
Well, it's interesting because like I should have that's a great idea. I should have walked around my junior high school saying that to every single person.
Every single other kid.
It's a little intimidating when it's 99 against 1 and you're like,
Right.
What are you waiting for a flood? And you know, you're the only one not getting invited to parties. You shouldn't be going to parties in 7th grade anyway, so.
No.
Anyway, so okay.
Oh, what were we talking about?
Social versus legal versus moral norms.
Right. Yeah. So then the question is, are there norms, or what are the norms that govern trusting people? And of course, turns out like there are such norms, and of being trustworthy. So there's norms of trust and trustworthiness. And it turns out these are very important in any society. These are extremely important.
So this is a 4th category. So this is
no, it would be well. The question is then. The question is, what kind of norms are they? Which category would they fit in, or which overlapping? Like, because they can fit into overlapping categories.
So you call them epistemic norms? Is that what you called them?
Well, so then there's the further question of, in these norms of trust, are some of them epistemic?
Oh, okay. Norms of trust.
So they're epistemic norms of trust. And so I became concerned with that question as well.
Norms of trust. And you haven't said whether these norms of trust are social, moral, or legal. Right. You haven't said that yet.
Yeah. Well, I'm treating norms of trust as a subset of social norms, because they have to do with how we interact with others.
They're in the social.
The label social, I just mean it's having to do with living, like interacting with other human beings.
So the Venn you mentioned a Venn diagram. The Venn diagram, there's 3 circles. It would be in the social circle, the norms of trust.
And then there's the question of, is it also where in the circle is it? Is it in the overlap with these other categories? You know, but it's in that social circle.
Okay.
Yeah. So but as I got into, I guess just to put a quick conclusion to what I was saying earlier about this question of why is faith a good thing? If you understand faith as trust, which I now do, then you see that, well, in general, it is definitely a good thing that we can trust. It is a good thing that we are capable of entering into trusting relationships with people. Because if we could not, we couldn't even have a society. If you had to check up on absolutely everything, I mean, you talked about Descartes' method being exhausting. It would be like that. Like it would be, it's horrible. A quick route to just blanket skepticism about everything.
Yeah.
So we have to be able to trust at certain points. But
otherwise you would go to the grocery store, and how would you get your food? I mean, you have to trust. There's all sorts of trust going on there.
Right. So the way I ended up defining trust was like, well, trust is an accepted vulnerability, where you realize you are vulnerable. Like this person, or you mentioned grocery store, it's not just individual people, it's groups of people acting together that you can trust.
Right. Okay.
So you go to the grocery store, you're trusting all kinds of people. And there's the buying of the food and then the eating the food.
Yes.
You are making yourself vulnerable to whoever was involved in that process that could have done something to make it dangerous. Mm-hmm. But you accept that. And so I would call it trust. It's not just that you're aware of the vulnerability and you accept it, but it's that you do so optimistically. Like, I think this is going to turn out fine. Right. So
I cooked bacon the day. I cooked bacon and it turned out fine.
Yeah. I poured some Raisin Bran in a bowl, put some almond milk on it, and ingested it.
You put that into your body, even though you didn't see who put that in the box.
Right. I didn't track the process. I didn't make sure nobody anywhere somehow managed to sneak a little poison in there.
Some Drano instead of.
Right. Yeah. And if I couldn't do that, then man, I'd have to make all my own food. I mean, I'd spend all my time just trying to get food.
And you'd have to guard it all the time.
Yeah. So it's a wonderful thing that I can trust one another. So then we see that trust enables the division of labor. And division of labor is key for all kinds of stuff. So then the question for me is, can we also divide epistemically, getting knowledge, and then pass around knowledge on trust, so that I can know, all kinds of things that I could not otherwise know if I just doubted everyone all the time. But that does mean I'm vulnerable. So then, and certainly there's such a thing as being too open to vulnerability. So if there is a threat, it's good to be able to, defend myself from the threat, if there is a threat, right? So
hey, you're talking my language.
Yeah, that's right. So you want to be able to know where threats are and defend yourself from them, but you can't see everything as a threat all the time.
Sounds right.
And you want to live in a society where there are corresponding, for the norms of trust, there are corresponding norms of trustworthiness. And many people will say, probably rightly so, that the norms of trustworthiness are the more important ones. Because trusting is going to really not serve you well if you're in a society that doesn't have adequate, or might say corresponding norms of trustworthiness. So, so the fact that we can rely on others to be trustworthy when we trust them is really important. But they're only going to be trustworthy if they themselves are, we might say, responsive to norms of trustworthiness, or have been shaped according to norms of trustworthiness.
Gotcha. I'm tracking with this. Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of that, and this is just to make a connection back to the reliablism. A lot of this is stuff that we don't have immediate access to. In the sense that, like, I don't have internal access necessarily to all the norms that are governing trust and trustworthiness in my society. And whether I do or not, a young child almost certainly would not.
Yeah.
Be able to reflectively know what the norms are.
No,
and
not reflectively.
Right. And yet it seems like those norms are setting up the case in which it can be an intellectually good thing for me to trust what someone says, at least in certain categories, in certain ways, and then proceed to live my life accordingly as if that's true. In other words, believe it. So that I mentioned children. So this is where, in the literature on this topic, the case of children gets a lot of emphasis, because the idea is, you don't want to make your demands of what it takes to know so stringent that you end up ruling out,
kids knowing things,
using at kids of knowing things, and knowing things on the basis of testimony of trust.
We want kids to be able to know things in our theory.
Yes, in general, that's you can quote me on that. I want kids to be able to know things.
That's very common sense. A lot of stuff we learn is in childhood.
Right.
Now, what's the benefit of spelling all this out? The benefit is so that we come to an awareness of what the norms of trustworthiness are, and we reflect on them.
That could be a benefit. It can help in diagnosing when things go wrong, whether that's in society or among individual relationships.
Isn't that kind of a point for internalism a little bit? Because it sounds like we want to be able to reflect on this.
Yeah, and just because you're using some of the, I guess you could say, some of the insights of externalism doesn't mean that you want everything to be external. Just like if someone's not an evidentialist, it doesn't mean that they think evidence is unimportant, right?
Yeah.
So
okay. I got you.
You might still think evidence is very important. You might still think it would be good to be able to be aware of this stuff, even if you don't have to be, in order to be enabled by it to know things. Anyway.
Well, it sounds like, is it fair to say that you have a rough, common sense understanding of how this goes, and you're trying to match up with your work with that somehow? Like if like you said, kids know things, that seems like a very common sense thing to say. And you seem to think that that's the benefit of your theory, that it helps us understand how that could be.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Oh, but also that I guess you could say, when it comes to the academic debate, one thing that you tend to do. So I mean, earlier I talked about how it's a little bit problematic that you have to build a reputation by, attacking other people's views. Nevertheless, it is something that, like, if you think somebody's wrong, it's good to be able to point out where you think they go wrong. And so I think that theories of knowledge or testimonial knowledge that rule out children knowing things because they trusted appropriate objects of trust, I think that would be a bad thing for that theory. That shows that there's some kind of problem there. So that's one of the benefits is to be able to say, like, okay, well, how does this help us understand knowledge more generally? Another benefit would be, well, I mentioned before, another benefit is pointing out how things go wrong in society more generally. And so our society, as you're probably aware, is having a real trust crisis.
Yes.
And but this has been going on for a long time. So when I was doing my research, I was working on my dissertation between roughly 2009 was probably when I first started putting together ideas, and then I defended it in 2015. So that was about 7 years-ish, 6, 7 years on probably about 6 years of actual working on the dissertation. And so in the process, I was reading all this literature on trust and research on social trust and things like that. And I was reading stuff from like the 80s and 90s that were talking about the crisis of trust in society. And that there's these measures of trust. And of course, you can debate how reliable they are, but measures of social trust showing a consistent just down, like from the time they start measuring them, the whole time they've just been going down and down and down. And by social trust here is meant usually trust in the institutions of society, government, business, religion for that matter, like organized religion, just a steady decline of trust. And where this kind of trust is often understood as, maybe this is worth saying at this point. So when we talk about trust, I see trust as involving, I already mentioned the optimism, right? Like I'm vulnerable, but I'm optimistic in spite of my vulnerability that I'm still going to get whatever it is I'm trusting you for.
When we're talking about the grocery store, yeah.
Right, but there's two possible sources of failure, I guess you could say. My trust in you might end up being disappointed because you are just completely incompetent in the matter where I trust you. Like that's a possibility, right? Like you didn't mean to be untrustworthy, you just failed. Like that's a possibility. So when you trust someone, you're optimistic about their competence. But then when it comes to at least human beings, as opposed to like machines or something, you're also trusting their goodwill. So someone might be perfectly competent, but not motivated to actually be trustworthy where you are concerned. So there might be some way their will is working against you. And it seems like when it comes to the trust in society, sometimes it's competence, but often it's a distrust of the other person's will.
Yeah.
So there was this theorist who was pretty influential in some of this conversation named Russell Hardin. And I forget where he like what institution he was with. And I even forget if he was primarily a philosopher or a social theorist or what his role was. But he defined trust. And I don't really agree with his general definition, but I think there's an important insight in it, where he said that you trust somebody if you think that their interests include your interests. So he called this the encapsulated interest view. So if I think that whatever's in your interest, it is in your interest to act for my interest, then I will trust you. Now, I think that there's more to it than that. And there's a lot more to be said, but I think that point is correct as far as it goes. And it's certainly true that if I think your interests are contrary to my interest, then I'm going to be less inclined to trust you. And it seems like that's where a lot of the breakdown is we no longer as a society believe that the people in charge or running or actually carrying out the day-to-day business of government, of at least large corporate businesses, of in many cases religious institutions, just not believing that their interests are in our interests. A lot of people don't believe that. If you ever hear someone who says like, well, the politicians are just out for themselves.
Right.
That's a way of saying they're serving their own interest and their interests are not in my interest. If they were, this is just an interesting side thing, but people, and so the trust in politicians has been going like this, except when it comes to people's own representatives in Congress. That's held steady. So people tend to trust their own representatives, they just don't trust anyone else's representatives. Right? So, but then there's a explanation for why that might be. They might think if it's my representative, then our interests do align. But if it's somebody else's representative, our interests on the line. And so I don't trust them, but I do trust the one who's from my hometown and is motivated to keep me happy. See, so Russell Hardin's encapsulated interest can kind of explain that dynamic.
Yeah, with Congress, there's a whole lot more going on there. With specifically Congress, it's called the phenomenon's called the it's linked up with what Morris Fiorina called in his little book on Congress the decline of the marginal district, the vanishing marginal district, where there's a phenomenon with Congress, that's the House of Representatives especially. I'm not sure about the Senate in particular, but I'm talking about the House, where incumbency confers some kind of benefit on running again for re-election. Let me pause this really quick.
Okay.
All right, so we are talking about trust, confidence in people, their competence, and their goodwill.
Mm-hmm.
Some people cash that out in terms of interests aligning. I think I'd be a little bit hesitant. I'm skeptical about that, because I'm not sure what it means for my interest to align with other people. And it seems like goodwill just means that not necessarily that we have the same interest, but that it means something else, I think. But that's just my first take on it. But we're barely scratching.
I agree. I think it's I do think that's insufficient. I think there's an insight there that can be helpful.
Okay.
At least in some contexts, but
we're barely scratching the surface here. I can already tell, because we were talking about Congress, and we're talking about the vanishing marginal districts. Marginal districts are the ones that you call blue or purple. I'm sorry, they're not blue, they're purple. The districts tend to there's some marginal districts where it could go either way, you know. But there's not as many as there used to be, and incumbency seems to have some kind of benefit of the person running for re-election. And so, you know, people look at this and they try to explain what that is, what's going on there. But it's a little puzzling to me. I'm not sure if I've figured it all out. It's troubling to me, to be honest with you. It's very troubling. Congress is troubling to me.
Yeah.
Some people want to limit the number of times you can run for re-election, called term limits. I'm not convinced that that's an answer to the problem to me, because.
So would the idea might be that the longer someone's in, the more, I mean, just to put it in terms of like the stuff I'm talking about, you might say that they think that they become less trustworthy because they become more, you know, rooted in the system or something, and then their motivational structure gets realigned in a different way. That means they're no longer really working for the good of the people. So their interests have all gotten out of whack, and so
something like that. It's pretty close, I would say. The last thing you said, I think, is close, about the structure. How the structure. I think you can trust congressmen and women to do what's in their interest. I do think that you just have to be aware of what that is. That's you can trust them, but what are you trusting them to do?
Right. So the way you use the word trust. Sometimes we use it that way, but that's what some people call predictive trust. Well, all you mean is you can reliably predict that this will happen.
Okay.
But that's a different kind of trust than.
It's a good distinction.
I'm placing my trust in you. You know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely. So, well, I don't place my trust in I never have. I've never done that.
Right.
I look at it as like you should be just trying to predict what will happen.
Well, one thing that I learned in my research is there are some social theorists like economists and others who that's just what they think trust is just the ability to reliably predict what someone will do. And that's what it means to trust someone, is to be able to predict their behavior. And so I really thought that was insufficient to catch the fullness, like the full concept of trust, especially as it would relate to like having faith in someone or something like that.
I don't think that's how the founders looked at just specifically government officials, elected officials, because they had a very skeptical view of human nature. They had a biblical view of human nature, really. I mean, the Federalist Papers, it comes out in those. But yeah, the way they designed government was that.
Can I ask you a question about that real quick? I realize
Sure.
this is me interviewing you now, but I'm curious about this. So because you're the expert on you're the guy who has the political theory expertise relative to me anyway. So
I'm glad I'm glad my evil plan to present myself that way has succeeded.
Yeah, that's right. You've manipulated me into that by working with a system that
it aligns with my interest.
Yeah.
Does it align with yours though?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Stupid
so you say, so there's this. So the idea that you just mentioned was that the founders had a biblical view of human nature.
Yep.
And so there's a view of human nature that was very common in that sort of Enlightenment era. That and I could see. Well, let me put it this way by a short anecdote. So one thing that I find really fascinating to do is find old history books and read the last paragraph or two, because that's where the author of the history book puts in their vision for the future, where they think all this is headed. And so there's this history book that I have that had belonged to, I think it belonged to my grandfather. But he had obviously gotten it from like his father or grandfather. So it was like published in 1904, I think. And it was like
love it.
Something edition of something. I think it was a later edition of something originally published in the very late 1800s.
Was it scholarly or was it some guy?
Well, it was a text. It was like a textbook. I mean, it was
cool.
Authors. It was written to be, I assume, like a high school textbook, maybe a university textbook. I don't know. I think it was called Drury's, Drury, I think, like History of the World or something like that. And the very last paragraph says that the present outlook is that, I think it's put this way: reason and enlightened selfishness will at last triumph over all of the suspicions that have caused wars, and the era of universal peace will at last be ushered in. And evidence for this was like the European Parliamentary Union has been meeting. There's an international court now. So things are just about to get really, really good. 1904. So obviously we know
that's typical of a progressive mindset, and the progressive that's the progressive era. That it's called the progressive era. And if my examiner graders ever watch this, at least one of them will be the one that was a Democrat. She was a liberal Democrat. She's a great professor. Love her to death. She taught my American Political Development course. The other guy, my mentor, Michael Uhlman, had a different view of the progressives, but the progressive era was, she would say that it was it wasn't just one thing, it was many different things. But typically when we think of the progressive era, it would include something like a very optimistic view of the future. If we just tweak certain structures, it's all going to be fine.
Yeah,
and that's not the view of the founders. Yeah, the founders.
Right. Yeah. So I was going to try to make the connection, because they had this idea that it's enlightened selfishness. So there's selfishness, but it's now enlightened selfishness.
Yeah, sure.
So this was the question I was warning about. So the founders would have assumed selfishness, right? And so you've got to have checks and balances to mitigate the selfishness that people are naturally inclined toward. And I take that's what we mean like a biblical view is the sin nature, that we're turned in on ourselves, that we're. Am I understanding you correctly so far?
Yeah, sure. In terms of American government, okay. Now we're talking about the federal structure. Right. So I'll just restrict myself to the federal structure, right? So you have separation of powers. Separate. A lot of people start with checks and balances. That's actually not. You start with separation of powers. You
So that's
separate
what we
the
have:
powers.
executive,
Yeah, you
executive
separate the
branch,
powers.
judiciary.
The reason is
legislative.
because people are such that if they have too much of these different varieties of power in the same hands, that's the definition of tyranny. That's what Madison says, and I think Federalist 48 or 47, 49, one of those. I think 47. And so that's how he defines tyranny is the accumulation of all powers, legislative, judicial, and executive in the same hands. And it could be in the same hands, whether few or many. It didn't matter how many people had that power and the same kinds of power. So that they were very suspicious of accumulating the different types of power in the same hands. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't believe that government should be powerful. A lot of people miss that too. A lot of people say we should have a small government and a weak government. That's actually not the founders' view. The founders' view was that for the right ends and with the right accountability, the government can be very powerful. Like, for example, in waging war. There's a perfect example where the executive branch needs to have as much power as it needs to win the war. And you can't say what that is ahead of time. And they had these, they didn't all agree. I mean, the founders were arguing amongst themselves all the time. And so they, one of the debates they had was how big the army should be and whether we should have a standing army. And is that scary and a threat? And somebody said we should cap the amount of the army at some arbitrary number of troops. And George Washington was supposed to have said in the Constitutional Convention, he was supposed to have, he didn't say much, but he was supposed to have said that he stood up and everybody looked at him and he said, well, tell you what, if we put something in there about it's illegal to be invaded with the same amount of people plus one, then I'll go along with that. But you can't, and everybody, and then quickly it was scrapped. It was like, yeah, well, this is absurd. You're talking about war and you can't predict that stuff. So, but yeah, I mean, just in terms of all of the machinations that they put into the thing, and I think they did the best they could. I mean, you know, they're just people, but I think they did a pretty good job, and they were not naive. They were not naive. And so when people would talk about, do I trust my congressman? I mean, I don't trust anybody in government. What are you talking? I don't trust the guy that works at the post office. I don't trust the people that do all sorts of things, you know. I guess like the people at YouTube is interesting. I just had a video removed yesterday that was a 3-hour conversation with Brad Cummings, the producer of the movie The Shack. We talked about
you better not mention why. You better not. mention why. That's when right.
And he said 2 words starting with EF, something to do with, and he didn't even say which year or what level of office. And he just mentioned his view about problems with and
the
so
social choice of leaders.
Yeah, I mean, I can just share my screen and share the email that I got, and it says that this 2 sentences was the reason to take down a video of 3 hours, and that had nothing to do with this specific issue. And by the way, the sentences did not say this, what they're saying anyway. But even if they did, I mean, the fact that the medium is going to prevent any discussion of that is prima facie evidence to me of not a goodwill or no competence. So I don't trust YouTube, basically.
Or a nice combination of the both.
What's that?
A nice combination of the both, perhaps.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's just the oddest thing. Like, how do you have a conversation? Are we supposed to have a conversation about everything else, but that? How do you even double check? How can anybody somehow double check and see if that's really
Yeah.
a violation or whatever? Even,
and I noticed at the very beginning of the email, it says, we think, so there's automatically backing off of the, like, we know. That's usually a way of that's a way of signaling I'm not going to claim knowledge here.
Yeah.
But
I have a friend. Yeah, I have a friend that's a rapper in LA, and he grew up in Compton, South Central, and I keep trying to get him to come on here, and I will succeed eventually. But he texted me last night, and he said that that YouTube will allow degradation of women in rap music, any number of obscene and harmful songs and rap stuff, and yet you can't talk about this one thing. It starts with EF, regarding a recent contest for a certain office in the United States. So anyway, so that's what we're dealing with. I've had issues with trust in higher academics too, like just in terms of so I see the application for this trust issue everywhere, and I'm guessing you did too. That's why you got into this. You got into this trust business. Yeah.
That's right.
Is there anything that you've discovered in this that was surprising to you?
That's a good question, because like I don't know that any conclusions I arrived at are some that I would be like, wow, I did not expect that. It might just be learning ways of thinking about it that I thought were helpful. I mean, there's stuff I didn't know, obviously, a lot of stuff I didn't know. But the idea that I think one thing that was not surprising, but maybe I'm almost surprised at how the thing I already believed is just so even that much more obviously true, is the absolute indispensability of trust for any good relationship whatsoever. And so if I were to go all the way back to that question about, well, why would God say we have to have faith? It turns out that everybody has to have faith if you're going to have any kind of a good relationship at all. And so it applies to being rightly related to God. It applies, well, if you're humans like us, who are limited creatures. And that's why, because we're so limited and so finite, we are so vulnerable that we have to be able to trust others. If we try to live within the bounds of our vulnerability without trusting others, then, I guess you could say it's not quite the Hobbesian phrase of, I think it was Hobbes, life would be nasty, brutish, and short. That's the, in the state of nature, not depend, the war of all against all. But it would be something kind of like that. Like life would be, I guess it would be nasty, brutish, and short.
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't be able to do that much for yourself if you were just determined to do stuff for yourself. But then when it comes to, if we think beyond just staying alive or surviving, or for that matter, having comforts beyond just survival, just having a good relationship with someone.
Yeah.
Just having a friendship or a good spousal relationship or something like that. Like there's got to be trust. You've got to accept vulnerability, and you've got to accept it optimistically, with the idea that, I've got to trust, and I'm not going to, and this is where it can, where the reason, one of the reasons why, it's not that an evidentialist internalist could not also do this. I'm sure they could. But one of the reasons why I felt like it fit nicely with that virtual reliableness framework is because you accept that I'm not going to have complete transparency on all, like I'm not going to be able to first vet everybody for trustworthiness.
Right.
I'm just not going to be able to do that. So I've got to accept my vulnerability. And at a fundamental level, I've got to accept it fundamentally. Like there's no getting behind it to absolutely guarantee that this person is trustworthy, that this institution is trustworthy, that for that matter, God is trustworthy, right? Like I am fundamentally limited. So I might be able to do some things, and it is wise to do some things up to a certain point to try to vet for trustworthiness.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm going to hit my limit. And when I hit my limit, I can either become just a complete skeptic, I can back off, I can become fearful, or I can, to borrow a phrase, step out in faith and go ahead anyway.
Right.
So does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think you gave us the title for the episode. Everybody has to have faith.
Yeah.
Something like that. I think you said that.
Right. Yeah.
I agree. I mean, I think the issue of trust is central. I think it's really helpful to think through in a disciplined way how that is and why that is. And if for another reason, maybe we come to just realize that and accept that in a deeper way. And then maybe what we can do is work toward strengthening our bonds of trust, if that's possible. Is that possible, you think?
Yeah, so this is
Is there
where
anything we can do?
where maybe the practical payoff, which is something I'm still working on, especially if it goes beyond like philosophy of religion concerns and so forth, is okay. Well, then, if you think there's a crisis of trust in society, what do you do about it?
Yeah.
And some people, sometimes the question's put almost like this: how can we get the people to be more trusting? Of course, the better question is, how can we become more trustworthy? How can
about the
make
things
more
that we should
trustworthy?
be trustworthy about?
Right. Yeah. Because so some, I mean, there are some government reports you can find out there that delve into, yeah, what can we do to increase the trust of the people in government? That don't necessarily get into, well, okay, maybe the reason people don't trust various institutions because they really aren't trustworthy, and the institutions need to change in some way to become more trustworthy. Now, in some cases, it may be just that people have a bad perception. Like I do think that something that I know you're very aware of is that in general, people in the United States today, people who have grown up in the United States today, have very little idea of how the government is supposed to work. Like you mentioned, separation of powers. Like, why is there separation of powers? And so you have people who will basically, like, for instance, people are saying, well, maybe we should elect the members of the Supreme Court. Why should that go through the process it goes through? Why shouldn't we just directly try to elect justices the way that we do, the president or something? Mm-hmm. And of course, there's reasons why it's structured the way it is, but if people don't know what those reasons are, then they're going to be suspicious. So there's
and some of the way it is not good, and it's recent. It's not like, for example, televising the Senate Judiciary Committee hearings. That's recent. Mm-hmm. And there weren't these problems before. It used to be, I mean, like, if you go back to John F. Kennedy's only nomination to the Supreme Court was Byron White, and his committee hearing lasted, I think, an hour, and he smoked cigarettes during it. It was not a problem. It was not a problem. Yeah. And he this is a Democrat president mm-hmm. who appointed Byron White, and Byron White was one of the dissenters in Roe versus Wade.
Wow.
A lot of people don't know this.
I did not know
the last Democrat that had any kind of sanity on abortion. So well,
that's just because he was Catholic.
Well, there's a lot of Catholics like Ted Kennedy.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, Ted Kennedy switched. Right. I mean, Joe Biden, supposedly Catholic. Mm-hmm. I know you're kidding, but there's when you add cameras, actually, it changes the dynamic. It now becomes a circus. Mm-hmm. Becomes more of a circus, and the senators are performing. Yeah, and it's even worse with YouTube now. It's even worse because mm-hmm. now those things get spliced and diced, taken out of context. Mm-hmm. There's some pretty troubling technology on the rise, and I'm sure you're all over this as far as what you're thinking about. There's technology that supposedly will allow fakes. Yeah,
the deep
videos. You're aware of this? Okay, doesn't surprise me that you're all over this. So this, I think it's going to become more challenging in terms of trust, because the mediation of technology, like you said, you don't believe I'm really in San Francisco, even though the Golden Gate Bridge is presented very clearly behind me.
Right.
There are, I would say, I'm an evidentialist, so I would say there's indications, though, that that's not really the way it is. For example,
right,
you
right.
see
And I would
certain
agree
things
with, and I would agree with you.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
I would say I do have good reason,
just
good
pay
evidence to
pay
doubt
a
that.
little bit more attention, but
Yeah,
my
yeah.
but anyway, but I wanted to ask you eventually before we get off that whether you're an evidential or whether you're an internalist or whether you kind of ditch
Yeah,
that.
so I would say I would say I'm not in the sense that I'm like a convicted anti-internalist or evidentialist, just more like I'm not convinced.
Of internalism?
Right, internalism or evidentialism, or the combination of the two.
You don't
And
have enough evidence?
It really has to do with the fundamental claims of like, that this is going to explain all of our knowledge, as opposed to it's going to account for a lot of it, right? So the
Fair enough.
yeah,
I just wanted to ask you that.
One thing that I found as a benefit from taking the approach I did is that I think one of the results for me, that because I mentioned how I'm naturally skeptical earlier, and like I am one of those people who has a sort of a natural Cartesian bent to like look for reasons.
And yet you're a Christian, so a lot of people would be like, "What is going on here? You're skeptic, and yet you
so
believe."
was Descartes. Yeah.
So
What's
going on with that?
Well, so one conclusion that all my research led me to was the idea of, well, I shouldn't find it surprising that there are some things that I can't drill all the way to the very bottom and show you from the bottom up exactly why I can be absolutely confident in every bit of this, or why, I believe it is grounded in reality, but I can't show you that, and I can't show me that at the most fundamental levels. At the most fundamental levels, I just accept on trust. And in this case, it is getting closer to a blind trust. Now, I think trust is consistent with having evidence. So some people try to oppose the two. Like if you have evidence, then it's not trust. Some people talk about trust that way. But are you smiling to an angel that just...
I saw a God. No, just kidding. So did you have an experience, a powerful like religious experience that's really at the root of this? Or did you, like as a kid, did Jesus appear to you?
So I was raised in a Christian family, and you might see because of that, I've always been a little bit skeptical of my own convictions, because like, well, this is the way I was raised. So of course people tend to believe the way they were raised to believe. And so that's been part of my like anxiety in the background the whole time, is like, maybe I'm really being irrational, even though this is the way the world seems to me.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a kind of irrational. Maybe I've just been, brainwashed into believing all this stuff.
Were you raised communist?
No, and I'm not a communist.
See? How can you trust your non-communism?
Exactly.
See?
Yeah, exactly. See? Exactly. Yeah. So so I didn't have any great religious. I mean, I guess I've had normal religious experiences, like, like the stunning answer to prayer that happens, that you're just like,
cool.
Of course I could explain that away. Like I could play the skeptic, but why? If I think there's a better explanation. So, but I also I'm not surprised that, look, I'm a limited finite being. And I do believe that, I believe there's a God that is behind everything and that is holding me and you together at this moment. And I could give you various arguments. Like I'm a fan of natural theology, for example, but I put it in terms of a fan because I do think it has limits. I think it's helpful for certain things, maybe not helpful for some other things. But I could do that, and I think I found a lot of help in going through natural theology arguments.
Natural theology is like
the natural theology, so that's the
arguments.
attempt to just know things about God based on common human reason and experience. So without appealing to any kind of special revelation, whether that's scripture or personal religious experiences or whatever. Just looking at like, okay, what's common human, so like what's experiences common to me and other people, and then thinking about it really hard. Can you know that God exists? Can you know anything about God?
So you think that's a legitimate discipline?
I think it's legitimate. I am sympathetic with those who think it has limited, let's say, apologetic value or evangelistic value, right? So people who would, because there are some people who think like, well, if you're going to do apologetics, which is the defense of the Christian faith, right? Or if you're going to do evangelism, so spreading the gospel of Christ, then this is the way to do it, is like, start running out arguments for the existence of God and convince everybody. And I think it might have some value for some people, but it's kind of limited.
So are you like more on Plantinga's side? It sounds like you're like on Plantinga, you're the warranted Christian belief kind of thing.
Yeah, so Plantinga has been, he's been influential on me for sure. Yeah.
Well, he's a guy. He's retired. He was a guy at Notre Dame for a long time. You can look him up.
But he did say, but I'm not like a presuppositionalist. So the presuppositionalist is the one who says, Cornelius Van Til, John Frame, others, who says, look, it's just a matter of presuppositions. Everybody has their presuppositions. We can't directly.
Everybody begs the question against everybody.
Yeah, everybody begs the question. And so all you can do is kind of just look at, like, examine the worldview as a whole and ask internal coherence kind of questions.
So you don't go that far.
I don't go that far. Right. And Plantinga himself did. And as you're aware, he had that paper, like 24 or so theistic arguments. And he was like, I think they're good arguments. I think they're sound. You know, I just don't think you have to have them. So I'd be on that band. Like, I don't think you don't have to have that, but I do think it's there and it's available and it's good.
God created people in such a way that they could have an experience and believe in God and not quite understand exactly what just happened.
Yeah.
And be totally rational in that belief in God.
Right.
That's Plantinga's view. Is that your view?
Yes.
Okay.
I remember reading a story about this. It was actually written in some magazine by someone who had been an atheist and became a theist. So someone who does believe in God, didn't become a Christian or anything, just started believing in God and was writing an article explaining it. And this person said they were just in the bathroom, like in the shower, taking a shower, and just all of a sudden realized they believe in God. And just called out to their significant other in the other room, "Hey, I believe in God now." And the person's like, "That's nice, honey." You know, but it was just like, and they just described it as like, I just suddenly realized this is the way I see, like, it wasn't like a religious experience. It was just like, this is the way I really do see things. There's got to be a God. And I can't and it wasn't like I'm giving you an argument. It's just like, that just somehow that makes more sense. You know, now maybe this person could give it, like, maybe if they sat down and thought really hard about it, they could start to identify, here's the exact thoughts that lead me to that conclusion, right? But they wouldn't have to do that. And from my perspective, that could have been, now I don't have to say it was in that particular case, but that could have been just like, there was some kind of internal God-given ability to perceive truth that for whatever reason got activated in the shower in that moment, you know?
Yeah. Or it could have been a bunch of things coming
that's perfectly
along.
rational. That would be an intellectual virtue in the sense of an ability to perceive and acquire truth.
Yes. Well, if God did design the world, and that's part of our view, God designed the world. He created us. He created all the epistemic faculties that we rely on. For example, getting around, like sensory faculties that are ordinarily very helpful in coming to true beliefs about the world that we live in. And I mean, without hearing, for example, or seeing, be hard for me to trust you. It'd be hard for me to know even very much about you at all, to be honest with you. So God created all that in such a way that it's ordinarily reliable. In a certain context, I might see a flower and be overcome with its beauty and intricacy and delicacy and all those kind of aesthetic properties that I might not be aware that I'm forming an inference there that God exists, or maybe it's not an inference, maybe it's just like a causal sequence. I don't know exactly how to cash it out, but it seems like maybe I could be sort of unconscious about what I believe about what nature can squirt out and what kind of things aesthetic properties really are, and think that it's a transcendental thing I'm looking at or I'm acquainted with somehow, beauty. It doesn't seem like if it's not reducible to anything biological or chemical or physical, and I'm aware of that, maybe I can't articulate it. Maybe, but I think you're saying that you don't even have to be aware of it. Just that God can kind of flip a switch in your soul, and you see everything.
Right.
You see that He exists and He created the world. I mean, that is very compelling to me. I'm not sure I quite, it seems like philosophy would just be about answering objections then at some point, or swatting away.
Well, you can also take the, you see that phrase right there?
Credo ut intelligem.
Intelliagam.
Okay.
Yeah, intelliagam. So that's the Latin phrase that means, I think it's the one that means I believe in order to understand. I believe. It's sometimes, I mean, I don't actually know Latin. Somebody told me what this means to them.
I've always wanted to study Latin.
I believe in order to understand, I believe. I believe in order to understand.
Sounds right.
So it's not I understand first, then I believe. It's the other way around. And so this is a phrase that's associated with Augustine. And then I think this exact quote comes from Anselm. So these are both Augustine, of course, the Saint Augustine, and Saint Anselm was like 100 AD-ish. But the idea there was I think
add about 1,000 years to
so
that.
Faith's right.
I think you said 100.
So faith seeking.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry, 1,000.
That's all right.
Yeah, sorry about
that.
Right. So faith seeking understanding, the idea of like, well, I believe it, but I can seek a deeper understanding of it.
Yes. Yeah.
And so someone who has that kind of experience might be like, okay, well, I find that I believe in God. Now let me seek to understand that more deeply. And then they might end up doing like some natural theology, or for that matter, just doing straight up theology.
And the benefit of that would be just becoming more mature. Or
yeah, well, that's an interesting question. Like, well, what is the benefit? Like, why would you want to seek understanding if you have faith? And I think part of it is an idea of maturity. It's growing up. It could be becoming more confident in one's faith. There might be something.
Yeah, I was going to say that, like more trust. Actually, it deepens trust, maybe.
Right. And so this is actually one thing. Again, I don't know if it's something I was surprised by in my study, but how many people seem to think that trust is like opposed to having evidence and reasons. And how I came to conclude like that just can't be right. So consider, for example, someone who says, well, look, if I trust, then I can't know. If I know, then there's no longer trust involved.
That's not quite right?
So yeah, it doesn't seem quite right.
No.
So I think I can know through trusting, but if I know, but then I know it's, but I know through trust.
We know through trusting. That's a good one. So
some people would say when it comes to title. What was that one?
We know through trusting.
Yeah. So
not in spite of trusting.
Right. Yeah. So, but there are some who would say like, well, look, they would apply that to like believing what someone else says. And they would say like, well, look, if I know that you're trustworthy, then my belief, suppose you tell me you're in California, and then I say, well, I believe that Lucas is in California because, that's a trust-based belief. It's faith-based. It's a faith-based belief. I trust Lucas when he says he's in California. They say, but you have good reasons to trust Lucas. Therefore, it's not really trust. What you're actually doing is you are just you're making an evidentialist kind of argument in your head, and therefore it's not trust. To which I would respond, wait a minute, are you saying that if you know someone is trustworthy, then you can't trust them? Are you saying you can only trust people who you don't know are trustworthy? Because it seems to be like the opposite is true, right? Yeah, it's actually much easier to trust people when you know they're trustworthy.
Yes.
Right? So now I would say this, if I knew independently from your word, like if I traveled to California, knocked on your door and opened it, and then looked at you standing there in California, then that would not be, I would no longer be basing my belief on trust because I see it. So I now, it might still be trust in my own perceptual abilities,
right.
But it's no longer trust in you and your word.
Yes.
Right. So if I can see it by myself independently of you, then of course it's not a trust-based belief because I have to depend on you for it to be trust in you. But gotcha. But that is consistent with me having all the best evidence in the world that you are trustworthy.
Right.
Doesn't make it any less trust when I believe what you say. It's still trust because I'm still vulnerable to you. Now I might have reason to think that you will, excellent reason to think you're not going to abuse that vulnerability.
Well, some people are very, that all makes sense. Some people, it brings up the issue of manipulation. especially like in politics and just in business, like in ads. Advertising just seems like a bunch of manipulation. And we can all see it, but it seems to work anyway, which is the weirdest thing in the world. People are worried about money in politics. There's a thing called Citizens United. It was a Supreme Court case that opened some certain purses of money, but not others. And I a lot of my colleagues were deeply worried about so-called money in politics, and I keep telling them, well, that's why I teach like logic and critical thinking. I mean, the money is wasted if people are just better at thinking and reflecting on what they're seeing. I mean, the money will go to manipulation is what it goes to. I mean, but manipulation only works if you're not like a thoughtful person, like I see it on the Republican side too. Like there's a congressman running in Texas, for example, that's a former Navy SEAL. I'm a big fan. Look, I was in the Navy. I got it. I was a big fan. I'm a big fan of this individual. I'm not going to say his name.
Okay.
His brother is also a twin. His twin brother, also a former Navy SEAL, and is quite famous. There was a film made about him, and for very good reason. Now it's interesting. He'll just show up, and everybody knows that that's the guy from that film, the Mark Wahlberg film, and therefore he's going to be a good congressman. Now, for me, there's a huge gap between you served in combat and I trust you to do combat well. I guess I didn't really trust you because I didn't even know you were over there doing the combat, because I don't know each individual SEAL. But it doesn't follow that you're going to have your eye on the ball on all of the particular things that representatives get caught up in, which because of the way the structure is with the bureaucracy and the relationship with the huge bureaucracy, which is permanent and actually has a say in its own budget, because they're permanent. You're there for 2 years and you don't even know what's going on. You don't even know how big this thing is. They have any number of ways to undermine you. You're supposed to keep that thing accountable. Well, that's a different skill set, but that's why the issue of trust comes in. But I could also talk about the AOC in New York. Some people that voted for her, they trust her because she had been a waitress. And it's like, oh, I'm a waitress. And look, she's got dark skin just like me. And so therefore I trust her, because,
but it's playing into it's playing into this idea, though, that if you have similar experiences to mine, then maybe you are more sympathetic, or what
our interests align.
Therefore, our interests are aligning, and therefore I can trust you. Like it might be something like that going on. But then the case of like, well, this is a celebrity, therefore it's that's what it makes sense of, except if it's just like, well, at least I know that name and I have a positive association. And so I step into the voting booth and I feel positive association with this name, and I have no idea what that name is. So I'll put the check mark by this one. Yeah,
it's weird. It deeply bothers me, and it bothers me just other stuff I see in politics in terms of, the name association thing is a big time thing that I just can't stand. But it's just basically people
tons of money just to have signs that just have a name on it.
And
scatter them all over the neighborhood.
Good.
It's just, and it's just going. Isn't it just going for name recognition?
That's
all
weird.
It's going for.
There's not even an argument. There's no evidence that they're going to do a good job. It's just their name on a poster. But people fall for that, and so what does that have to do with our discussion?
I've got another question for you. Then this is again, you being the political science, political theory guy, and I'm interviewing you. Do you think there is an obligation to vote? Apparently, I hear in Australia, it's actually you are legally required to vote. Like it's against the law to not vote in elections.
There's no law here.
I sometimes have with my students is I'll just put forward the question: is there an obligation as a citizen you ought to vote? And the argument I generally make is there is not, because you should really only vote if you actually take the time to make yourself informed. And therefore, if there's no obligation to spend the amount of time it takes for me to actually be informed, then there's no obligation to vote. because there should not be an obligation to be an uninformed voter. But then that means if you're going to be an informed voter, then to say that you must vote. So I mean, I'm using the word obligation, and I'm being ambiguous between legal obligation and moral obligation.
That's how we talk about obligations. Let me, and I'm not avoiding your question. I know some people do that, but I'm going to flip it around on you, and I'm going to pose a different question. Is there an obligation not to vote if you don't know what you're doing?
Yeah, so
a very different way of thinking about it.
Right. No, and so I'm inclined to say yes. So whenever I vote, if I don't if I only vote for those things that I feel like I actually know something about, whether that's candidates or if it's like, local ballot measures, certain issues. Like if I get down and it's like, there's a list of judges, and around here we vote for, there's judges on the ballot, there's school board and all this stuff like that.
There too, yeah.
If I have no clue, then I just skip it because it's utterly meaningless for me to check a box.
Yeah.
If I haven't taken the time to figure out what's going on. So, but then if that's true at the lower levels, that's got to be true all the way up. In fact, it might even be more true at the level of national votes, national elections. Now it's harder, maybe it's harder to be uninformed, maybe, when it comes to the national election. But it seems to me like if you're not going to be informed, then you're not helping anything by voting. And so you're just as well not voting.
Yeah, and what's it mean to be informed? Especially as knowledge is, well, I shouldn't use the word knowledge, as the raw material that you want to be acquainted with for this that's relevant is mediated through the media, which is where we get the word media.
When I mentioned social institutions with declining trust, that was a big one that I left off the list earlier. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and you see it with YouTube. I mean, if you I'll give you a different example. It was one that was mentioned in the video that they took down. How do I know? Do I really believe that that's the reason they took it down? Because a huge part of what we talked about in that video that they took down was that YouTube takes videos down. But the context for that was we were talking about the lockdowns and the quarantine and the public health panic in the last 2 years. And the absurd levels of trust that apparently ordinary people had in government bureaucrats to make these decisions about what's an essential business and what's not an essential business. Seems like it's like, how do you have the expertise to know what's essential and what's not essential? I mean, what kind of training even goes into making that judgment at all? And it seemed like people I talked to didn't think at all about those questions at all, unless they had a small business, then they were thinking about it. But if they had just a normal paycheck, then they were like, I don't care. So it was really disturbing, but there was a church that was fined. That was my grandfather's church, called Godspeak Calvary Chapel. They did, I think at some point, nightly YouTube sessions where they discussed all of these issues. They had medical doctors come on and talk about the data. I didn't watch all of them, but I watched a fair number of them, and they were quite thoughtful discussions, and YouTube took down those videos. So my point that I was making in the to Brad Cummings in the video that they took down recently, I'm going to appeal and try to get back up. You can listen to the audio of that 3-hour conversation on our website or wherever you get podcasts. It should be on Spotify still. I haven't checked, but it is on our website, republicanprofessor.com/podcast. Well, the issue I was bringing up was, let's say I want to do a PhD dissertation on how those lockdowns affected churches in Ventura County in California, which is where Godspeak is, in Thousand Oaks, Newbury Park. And I'm interested in that particular church because that particular church opened back up, and they were fined, and they were willing to take the fines because they believed so much in opening up for meeting together and their interpretation of communion and all that, which required bodily presence. And not to mention the pastor is a former mayor, former elected official there. So there'd be all sorts of reasons to do a PhD dissertation. Where's the primary sources now? I can't you know, I mean, I would have to
Mhm.
ask for those archives from them. Apparently they still have a copy, but you couldn't just publicly access them on something like YouTube.
Yeah. But so here's a thought. I'm
So,
honestly, I didn't mean to interrupt.
you
Yeah, go
know,
ahead.
but for me, that undermines trust in
Mhm.
social media when there's censorship like that, because
Right.
that's prima facie evidence to me that that you can't even consider the arguments that were made. It would be like going through a library and just not randomly, taking out books that had certain words in them. And then my real concern is for the kids and the future generations that don't have memory. Like I'm already teaching kids that don't remember 9/11.
Right.
You know, they don't have that memory. They don't basic stuff that we remember.
Mhm.
So I'm really concerned about like social media specifically
Yeah.
and like things like YouTube to that are undermining trust in huge segments of society. People can see this. We're not stupid. We can see
Right.
what's happening.
Right. But notice that the way they justify it is that they're trying to address the problem of trustworthiness. Is how it seems like they would justify it.
That's what they
The
said. It's
problem is there's
misinformation.
misinformation. In other words, untrustworthy information out there. So we're trying to do our part to improve the misinformation situation.
That's correct.
And
That's
so
what
this is
say.
what we're trying to make YouTube a more trustworthy place by getting rid of certain information. But
it's ironic.
Yeah,
it's ironic.
It is
it's having the opposite effect for me.
Yeah. But you can imagine there's other people out there who are like, yeah, I trust YouTube more now. Well, I don't know. I don't know if there's anybody actually.
Who is this person?
I mean, it's a figment of my imagination.
Well,
yeah,
I haven't double checked this, but it would be interesting for me to go through and I'm listening to a podcast called Another Way, which is run by a Democrat law professor, and he's had people on. He had Frank Letts on twice, who's like a public opinion guy. He's pretty famous. He has opposing sides on, and he's pretty fair and even keeled, and he's likable as a person, I would say, the host. But he had this guy on that was Trump's lawyer during that whole thing, and this guy had to resign. His name was John Eastman. He had to resign from Chapman Law School. Well, he felt like he was. I guess if you have to resign, you're getting fired, so it's voluntary. But he obviously felt compelled to resign because there was so much controversy about his representing Trump and how all that came down. Well, anyway, he had him on his podcast, and you can look it up Another Way. I'm not sure if that's on YouTube, but by the very email they gave me about the fact that we even mentioned that topic that they discussed. So if his video is still up there, then I will take that as prima facie evidence that there's political bias. And I already know that YouTube it's in Silicon Valley and it's run by people that are not Republicans, and they don't like Republicans.
That doesn't mean they're also running. Now this pushes in a slightly different direction, but they're also running according to a profit motive. And maybe if you are a content producer that brought in millions of views to their website, maybe they would tolerate certain things. But if you're not bringing, maybe.
But it's well known in the Second Amendment activism community that a lot of these people that run these channels that have high volume of views are just all of a sudden demonetized.
Oh yeah. Okay.
And so
YouTube's being noble and resisting the money.
It's odd. But that also means that the YouTube channel person now has to go to Patreon to get support to run the channel.
Yeah.
And it's not just Second Amendment people. It's people about questions about personal health decisions related to recent public health things that go in your arm,
Yeah.
maybe. And they have the same issue of being demonetized all of a sudden, or having videos randomly taken down.
Yeah.
And so how do you,
So I wonder if that costs YouTube itself anything. Like, are they sacrificing some of their own money to do that? I just don't know. I don't know how it works.
I don't know either. That's a really interesting question. I'm not sure exactly. It seems like they would still be making money, but not the channel now doesn't get a cut of it. That's how
So that's what I'm wondering. Like, so if the videos are there but are demonetized, then all the traffic keeps
That's
coming.
a good question to follow up on. Yeah, how is you? That's very good.
Like, if the video moved altogether, then obviously they're taking content off of their own site. But anyway.
Well, do you have time to tell us about the kind of courses you teach, and what do you like teaching about there? What do you like about South Carolina, if anything? What do you not like?
Yeah, so the first answer that my wife and I always give to people when they ask, well, we lived in St. Louis, obviously, before this, because that's where I did my dissertation. And I do got to put in a plug for St. Louis. I think it's an underrated city. We loved living there. It's great. A lot of, especially for young families, there was a lot of good stuff to do with young kids that was either free or very inexpensive and all that. But there's two downsides. One is you have to drive a very, very, very long way or fly if you're going to see the ocean. Another downside is you have to drive or fly a very long way if you're going to see actual mountains. And here we can take a day trip to the mountains or to the beach. So that's one thing we really like about living here. Just yesterday, in fact, we went down to Charleston, just did a day trip to Charleston, took our kids to see Fort Sumter, and then walked on the beach a little bit, and then we're home in time for dinner. Even though we ate dinner on the road, but it wasn't time for dinner anyway. So we love that.
I love Charleston.
Yeah. And I like not having a lot of snow, because we did get a fair amount of snow when it was very cold in St. Louis in the winter, even though my wife's a little more of a cold weather person than I am. So she misses it, but I'm okay without that. So where I teach, well, it's a small school. I am the one full-time philosophy professor here. There is an adjunct professor that teaches usually about a couple classes a semester. And so I teach Gen Ed. There's two required Gen Ed courses that I teach. One is Introduction to Philosophy, and the other one is a senior seminar in ethics. And it's called seminar, but it'll have, everybody has to take it, so they're large classes.
Oh, that's good.
It's kind of a capstone course. So it's not really like Intro to Philosophy Part 2. It's more like really trying to dig into certain ethical issues and then background questions about.
So you have two required courses that you have.
Two required courses. And I could spend all my time teaching those, but the reason why there's a part-time adjunct is because to free me up to teach some other courses. So this semester I'm teaching logic is the other course that I'm teaching. I'm teaching one section of ethics, two sections of Intro to Philosophy, and then one section of logic. And sometimes I teach an overload, but this semester 4-4 is my standard load.
4-4, okay.
Yeah, and that's sometimes I teach extra, but this semester I decided I didn't want to do that. My time was more precious to me this semester.
4-4 load, for those who are not in the know, it means 4 classes per semester.
Correct, right.
And anything then in the summer?
Summer courses. I do. I usually teach an on-class here in this. An on-campus class here in the summer. It's like a 2-week intensive. Sometimes I'll do Intro to Philosophy, sometimes I'll do ethics, and then the adjunct professor will do whichever one I'm not doing.
Which course do you enjoy teaching the most?
Of those, I enjoy different things about them. So I know that's kind of a lame answer, but really
it's realistic. It's realistic.
Yeah. There are different aspects I like of each one, and different I like not as much. One thing that I did for the first time last summer, and I'm planning on doing it this summer again, is we have a prison initiative. So just across, we're right next to the river. Broad River is a river that goes into Columbia. And right on the other side of the river from our campus is the Kirkland Correctional Institution, which is one of the big state penitentiaries. It's actually where death row for South Carolina is. Okay. But they have my institution, Columbia International University, has a prison initiative where students, while in prison, they can earn an associate's degree, and they take all the Gen Ed courses. And so they can take logic to meet part of their requirements. So I taught logic in the prison last summer.
You go into the prison?
I went into the prison and taught logic.
They don't bring them out?
They don't bring them out. That's right. So that was a fantastic experience.
What was that like?
It was great. I have a prison nickname now, so that was cool. I mean, it's a pretty simple one, Dr. J. So you could probably.
Were they freed up? Were there any kind of shackles or anything like that?
No. So it's a rigorous selection process to enter this program. So there's a lot of.
They have a lot of incentive not to screw up.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So it was 12 students in the class. It was their second year in the program. It's a 2-year program, obviously. It gets them an associate's degree. Once they're released, they can the whole thing transfers to CIU, so they can fairly easily finish their degrees here once they're released. But a lot of them are in for a long time, so I don't know how often that's happened.
Were you nervous about teaching in prison?
A little bit at first, but I've talked to enough other professors. Actually, there's several other professors here teaching the program, and every single one of them said it is their favorite teaching experience.
That's cool.
I like it more than any other teaching experience.
How were the students? Did they do the work?
They did the work. They were highly motivated. Did the work. So the logic class, it was probably the best logic class I've taught. And they weren't all like gifted logicians, obviously.
What did you use for a textbook for that class?
I used one that by Ryan Byerly, T. Ryan Byerly, called, I've used it for a couple years now, and I don't even see where I have my copy. I think it's called Logic, Introduction to Logic. I think it's over here, just a second.
No problem.
It's worth grabbing, I think. There we go.
We'll give him a plug.
Introducing Logic and Critical Thinking by T. Ryan Byerly. And he's a professor at a university in Sheffield, England, I think, but he's an American.
Okay.
But it's called The Skills of Reasoning and the Virtues of Inquiry. So it's got that virtue word in it.
Yeah.
And one of the things I like about the book, like it's got all the basic stuff you need for an introduction to logic, but then it has this section at the end that is about cultivating intellectual virtue. And so I like to intersperse that into the logic stuff. And that's where he covers a lot of the informal fallacies. So he'll take something like the post fallacy, and he'll identify it as a bad habit in reasoning, and therefore as intellectually vicious. And then he'll talk about what kind of attitude should we have. And he wrote this for Christian institutions, Christian schools. So a lot of the examples, examples are often theological in nature. And then when in the virtues of inquiry part, he puts it in terms of, as a disciple of Jesus, how ought you to go about thinking? It's kind of with that kind of.
Did that come up did Christianity come up in the prison?
Oh yeah, well, it's actually, I mean, this is a Christian school where I teach, so you actually have to you have to give a Christian testimony to enter the program in the first place.
So no complaints about the separation of church and state or anything like that?
No.
Okay.
In fact, the
how's the program funded?
Donors.
Donor. Oh, okay. Well, there shouldn't be any problems then.
Yeah,
I mean,
so
it is on state
donor
property.
funded.
Yeah.
It is on state property, and it's but everything's funded by donors. It's been, I think it's in its 13th or 14th year now. It has a close to 0% recidivism rate, which is almost unheard of in prison education programs. That's cool. And for your listeners, recidivism is returning to prison after being released from prison.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of prison education programs out there. And of course, again, you don't want to engage in the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, but that's impressive to have an education program with a very low, I think there's been a few, but it's been very, very, very few people who have gone through this program and been released who then ended up back in prison after 13 years anyway. So
that's awesome.
It's
interesting. I did not know.
But this is the way the program, it's one of my favorite things that this school does is this program. But the program it's meant to train prisoners to be chaplain's assistants in prison. So that's what they do. So that's one way they serve the system, is they'll apply. They can be at any prison in South Carolina, apply to this program. If they're accepted, they're all brought to this particular institution, put into a cohort, and then with that same group of like 12 to 14 men, they go through that program together. They take all the basic Bible theology classes, gen ed classes like Intro to Philosophy and the ethics course and the logic course, and they take all of this, and then they're sent out 2 by 2 in pairs to different prisons and jails around South Carolina, where they serve underneath an official chaplain, helping minister to prisoners. And apparently the program is very well respected in the South Carolina prison system, is what I've heard. It's had a salutary effect on the prison environment, and I asked students in the program, I said, are there other prison education initiatives, prison education programs in South Carolina? They said yes, but none of them have nearly as good a reputation as this one.
Wow.
In the prison system.
There's a dissertation or a set of dissertations that someone needs to write about that. Who came up with the idea, how it got funded? Do you have to raise support for it? Is that your role at all? Or
no. It's
trustees that do that?
There's a staff that works specifically for the prison initiative, and the people who, and of course there's, our school has full-time fundraisers for different things, and they work on this as well as other stuff.
Is there a website that people could go to if they were interested in supporting that?
There probably is. It's probably like ciu.edu/prison initiative or something like that. But if you Googled, Columbia
I'll trust Google.
Yeah. If you have like show notes or something you put in, you could find it.
I'll link that, since you've talked so highly of it and you're involved in it, and then it needs funding, obviously. So apparently
it was virtually shut down during COVID. So
man,
that was a real hiccup in the system, but because the prisoners spent most of the pandemic on lockdown, like completely. But then what they ended up doing is they did get a donor to fund putting in a like dedicated, because they don't want to have prisoners have internet access, so you can't do Zoom. But they've funded putting in a dedicated closed circuit sort of classroom environment between here and across the river. So if they do have to, if the prison is locked down, but the students can get out of their cells, then we can at least still do class sessions with the professors being remote. But of course, it's much preferable to be actually in person if you can do that.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there's got to be some interaction with the professor. It can't just be a videotape or something.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I when you said the prisoners were on lockdown, I thought, well, that's probably a little bit less problematic than non-prisoners being on lockdown, which is what in fact happened. But actually, I am ambivalent about prison. There's just that as a punishment. I'm not convinced. I don't know. I'm just.
You mean that it should be used as much as it is as a punishment? Is that what you mean?
Well, I think we over criminalize in our society anyway.
Yeah.
Way too easily.
Yes.
Simple majority. Yeah, that's a crime now. I mean, you see it in Second Amendment law, but it's in other things too. And it bothers me. And then the way we deal with people in the criminal justice system bothers me too. There's all sorts of stuff, but that's different.
Well, that's I believe the same thing. That's one of the reasons why when I was interviewing here for the position, I found out they had this prison initiative, and honestly, that was what I was most excited about.
That's cool.
When I first came here, was being able to start teaching in the prison. When I was in St. Louis, I had just started getting involved in a program that was supposed to begin doing prison education.
What is it about why were you excited about it? I guess.
Well, partly what you said is I think that there's some real justice problems, like without the way we do criminal justice and prisons, and using prisons as a means of justice in society. I think there's a lot of real problems there. And I read some books that convinced me that for most people who go into prison, it makes them worse. Most people who go into prison are like it has a corrupting effect.
Yeah.
On the human person.
How could it not?
Right. And so I wanted to be part of something that was trying to mitigate or respond or do something that had a salutary effect on the people who are in prison. So that was why I was wanting to do that, wanting to, communicate to people, if nothing else, by the very presence of like, you're still worth something, and educating you is still worth something. That's still a worthwhile investment. You still have something to contribute.
That's good. So it's very thoughtful. In other words, you have a theory about what prisons do. It's bad for the character and the souls of people there. And you want to help, given that is the modality of punishment for most felonies, I would say.
Right.
That you want to help mitigate that problem that you have. That makes sense to me. It's very thoughtful. So are you happy in Southern California, or are you happy in South Carolina?
Yeah, no, it's not Southern California.
Southern Carolina.
Yeah, we do have a USC here, but it's a different USC. So the actually they recently had to change the name to U of SC, apparently because of conflicts between the USC over there in Southern California. Anyway, but I'm very happy teaching here. I mean, there's no perfect institutions, and as you know, every university is going to have certain issues and so forth. So I'm not like, rose-colored glasses about anything, but I love teaching my students. I love being able to do what I do as a job. I'm happy here in South Carolina. We were able to, the cost of living is a lot lower than many other places. So we were able to afford a house that, we couldn't afford in most other places of the country.
Praise God.
So it's, there's a lot that I like about it.
And you're a skeptic, but you're a believer.
Yes, you could say that. My natural bent is towards skepticism, but I realize there's a limit on that. Yeah, there's a limit on that.
Skeptical believer.
Yeah.
Dr. Jonathan. Yeah. So
have you gotten used to being doctor yet?
People have been calling me doctor since I started teaching, honestly.
That's true.
I Loyola Marymount, where I was for over a decade, they always had my mailbox as Dr. Lucas. I don't know why. I never said that. It's just, it's not. What about you? Was it a big deal for you?
It just felt weird. It still sounds weird to me every now and then. It just strikes me every now and then.
Some people don't like having it next to their name.
Well, I got to say, I'm a little ambivalent about it. Especially, so here's one reason is at a Christian institution, you have this annoying verse. It's not really annoying, but where Jesus says, don't call anyone else father because you have one father in heaven, and don't call anyone else teacher because you have one teacher. And so it seems to be a general attitude toward being wary of taking pride in titles, Yeah. And so it's a warning about there's this danger in titles to make you think that, you kind of got it all going on and other people are below you. And so that's where I'm like, like there's this academic norm, and students do call me Dr. Reibsamen. And it's kind of an academic norm. And it's like, okay, I can understand why it can be helpful. A certain degree of formality and signaling who's a teacher and who's not, and all that. Like that can be helpful. But there is a danger in it. And so I'll tell students, if you're more comfortable calling me Jonathan, go ahead and do that. It's not offensive to me at all. And it can be a helpful reminder to me that I'm just Jonathan. And then once students graduate, there's a tendency to keep doing it. So I try to be quick to say, if I hear a graduated student calling me, Dr. Reibsamen, to be fairly quick to say, you can just call me Jonathan now. In fact, I remember Doug Guyvet.
Yes.
Because I would always call him Dr. Guyvet.
Yeah.
And then after I graduated, he said
he was our epistemology professor at Biola.
Yeah, and I remember after graduation, him saying, you've graduated now, so you should just call me Doug.
Yeah.
And so I kind of like that. I like that little transition.
Well, what you could do is you could flip it around. What you could do is you could say, call me my first name, but then call the student and just student last name.
Right. You mean so, instead of like Mr. or Ms. or whatever?
Yeah, we typically don't emphasize the student relationship. It's usually the student emphasizing the teacher relationship, but we don't typically double down and go student. But
Student Smith.
You call me my first name, but
what
I'll
do you
call
think,
you
Student Smith?
Yeah. So pupil Anderson here.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
I was going to mention earlier, so I do teach other classes besides those, but those are the ones I told you about are the main ones I teach. But I also get to teach things like philosophy of human nature, philosophy of science.
That's good.
Other things like that. So I get that in there. And often each semester, my favorite course, even though I like something about all of them, my favorite course is usually whatever upper level philosophy course I get to teach is.
Do you teach epistemology?
I haven't actually done that yet.
Oh man.
I had it lined up to teach one semester, and then it got canceled for low enrollment. And then I learned that I really actually have to promote classes, because if students aren't aware it's being offered, they're not going to register for it. And a lot of times they aren't aware. So ever since then, I've promoted whatever upper level class I've been teaching, and they've always gotten enough enrollment. So I'm gonna try it again sometime soon. But yeah, I haven't done epistemology yet.
Do you think that epistemology? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say the reason they're favorite is because the problem with gen ed classes is you always get people who would rather not be in the classroom.
Yes.
And it's pretty obvious, and that can really throw off stuff.
Yeah.
So when you have the upper level electives, in some sense, everybody wants to be in the classroom, and that makes a world of difference. And that was the case in the prison. That was one reason why I liked the prison so much, is those students really wanted to be there, and that makes a much better teaching experience.
Do you think that logic should be required?
Yes.
Do you think that epistemology should be required?
Yeah. So epistemology, I mean, it's tempting to just start saying, yeah, all the stuff I teach should be required. But it's also tempting to just say all the philosophy stuff should be required. But I realize you can't require everything. You've got to pick and choose.
Yeah.
So I don't know that I would say, I think an introduction to philosophy is good to have as a requirement. And I do think ethics is good to have as a requirement. And I think that logic, logic is really important, since students generally don't get it in high school. If they don't get it in college, they're probably never going to get it.
They're never going to get it.
But it's so, it's so important for being, a trustworthy voter.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so many basic things that you have to grapple with in that class if it's taught well.
Maybe the key is if it's taught well, because I think that probably a lot of people have experiences with a poorly taught.
Yes.
In fact, I hear that all the time. When people find out I teach philosophy, something I will often hear from people who've been to college is, yeah, I had a philosophy class once. It was terrible. I'll get that.
It was just a bunch of crap. It was just a bunch of made up stuff.
Well, a doctor I visited recently told me that. And he said it was because, I guess it was probably taught by a grad student. And as they often are at some schools, that have grad programs. And the grad student, and he said it felt like the whole class was just, this guy was working on a dissertation on something, and he was using us as an opportunity to talk about his dissertation research project. So that thing about focused on one little narrow thing, like the whole intro to philosophy class was all focused on this one little narrow thing. And so that was his experience with intro to philosophy. And of course, that whoever's in that class gets colored in their mind a certain way about what philosophy is.
Yeah, that's sad. And I've noticed a lot of sloppy thinking about fallacies as well. Mm-hmm. When I'll hear people say some name of some fallacy, and they say it in such a sloppy way, I can tell they've never thought deeply about it, but they know the name of it because it was on some quiz or something. Yeah. And I was just like, oh man, I don't know if it's
one of my favorites. It might not be the professor's to authority. Fault. Yeah. Or there's two that I hear. One is appeal to authority, where they bring it up like anytime you cite an authority, that's appeal to authority.
That's appeal to authority. Yeah.
No.
A fallacy.
And then there's also
take my word for it. It's a fallacy.
Right. There's also the either or fallacy, where they think anytime someone says either this or that, it's always a fallacy. It's
like, so weird.
No, that's not the fallacy.
Yeah. I don't know if it's the professor's fault. It's impossible to tell. I mean, actually, I've heard the ad hominem thing trotted out wrongfully too. I always tell my students it's not necessarily a fallacy. It could be relevant to what you're talking about. Like, for example, in a courtroom, if you're undermining the credibility of the witness, it is relevant to what they're saying. If it's got to be irrelevant, that's the thing. The issue. Yeah. Well, anyway, I mean, it could be that they just weren't taking careful enough notes, or whatever. I'm not
right.
I'm not
sure. You don't want to put too much on the professor.
No. I've seen how students as you know, yes.
Right. The old saying, "You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink," is relevant.
That's right. Well, we really appreciate you coming on and sharing just a little bit about your expertise in trust and philosophy in general. And I think we barely scratched the surface.
Yeah, we did. We barely
There's
scratched.
So many other things. I need to reflect on where to go from here in terms of like a episode 2, if you ever want to do a second one, where we chase down some of these threads. It seems like there's so many different things. Maybe you could do the same thing. You could reflect on further application of the trust issue.
Yeah. So one thing I haven't actually even published anything for my dissertation yet, because I went into teaching full time. And as you know, that absorbs all your time when you do that. So, but I'm now
you do it right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So, but I'm now getting a point where I'm comfortable, I've got my classes set well enough and I've taught them enough times that I feel like I've got a little more time opening up. So I'm really wanting to get back into, digging back into my my dissertation and starting to pull stuff out and write some papers based on it, things like that. So I'm planning on getting back into thinking about it again. So it's be a good opportunity to do some of that.
Yeah, well, maybe we can help you air out some ideas or chase down some threads for application.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Lucas.